it is actually serving or reminding us, those of us who have gone to school in America, the human rights waves of Trans Africa of 1980s, the fight against apartheid, the disbursement that was taking place in the United States. So I think the state of South Africa is still holding some of the true maverick positions of ANC.
All right, so I guess.
And remember also there are area of investments when it comes to economic relations, area of investments where the two countries have heavily invested in each other, Israel and South Africa, in terms of economic development. So how it would play out is a different ball game together in economic sphere. But also, I was just wondering, why didn't the South African state actually takes the case to ICC in case of ICJ?
Correct. Yeah, that's what I was actually wondering. And I think just a few minutes ago I was listening. I saw something on what do you call it, on LinkedIn, where Ramaphosa was trying to comment on trying to thank those who took the case over there. So I was asking myself, why didn't the South African state actually took the issue? But that is for another discussion, right? I think we can revisit that, right? It's almost 10 o'clock here in the United States, and we are still waiting for Dr. Amache to join us. But I think we can proceed. We have Lieutenant Tadkoka over here. So I think we can go ahead. So let's start. Hello and welcome to our listeners around the world on the Sankofa African series. My name is Dr. Akwe. I'm your rotational host for today's program. It's Friday, January 12, 2024, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time and 3 p.m. GMT Ghana and 5 p.m. Juba and South African time. I take this opportunity to thank all our listeners and viewers on the various social platforms. The program is actually being recorded on Facebook, YouTube, and I think Twitter, which is now X, right? So today we have a packed show with some familiar faces, right? And not so familiar faces across the length and breadth of the African continent. But before I introduce our guest, let me inform our listeners and viewers around the world that the Sankofa African Affairs is organized by Bell & Associates Consulting Limited in partnership with Budget IT. Bell & Associates Consulting is a policy research think tank based in Ghana, right? And it's mostly a consortium of independent consultants across the African continent and from the diaspora who are focused on African-centered approaches to addressing African issues. Budget IT, on the other hand, is a civic non-profit organizations that enhances citizens' understanding of the budget and matters of public interest using tech tools to raise the standard of transparency and accountability in government. It was actually founded in Nigeria in 2011 and recently expanded to other West African countries, including Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Ghana in 2020. For those joining us for the first time, this is the Sankofa African Affairs Program, basically a current and global affairs program or virtual panel discussion aimed at informing and educating Africans worldwide, either on the continent or the diaspora, about great power strategic relations and policies towards the continent. And also we try to look at contemporary issues, challenges, and events on the continent. So for the past 5-6 months, our focus has been on the United States. So we're talking about US strategic relations and policies towards the continent, which is focused on what you call the 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. I think in 2023, we focused much of our attention on diplomacy and a little bit of defense. So we are still addressing issues of defense, right? So today's program is a continuation of our defense, but it focuses on some of the challenges that's what the continent is facing. And we have our experts today who will be trying to delve into some of the issues, right? So our topic today is, why are the guns not silencing in Africa? The tragic case of the two Sudan. Some people will be asking why the guns are not silencing, right? The simple answer, maybe Dr. Atta Samoa can give us a better understanding of why the AU chose such a theme. But basically, maybe they are looking forward to, by the year 2030, that most of the conflict, if not all, will be brought to an end. So maybe in his opening remarks, Dr. Asamoah can give us a little bit more information about that, since I've seen videos of him on LinkedIn and an e-symposium where he participated in that, right? So today, to help us delve into the issues, we have Lieutenant Tad Hawker, who is a senior security sector reform consultant and a former US DoD Director of Policy for Africa. He's been very resourceful to this particular program, right? His contribution is unquantifiable. Since he has been able to bring most of his expertise, he's been on the continent for over 30 years, more than I have even lived on a continent, right? So we thank him for all his services. And also we have Dr. Benjamin Mashar, who's a political science professor at University of Juba, South Sudan, more or less also a rotational host of this particular program. So sometimes we rotate, right? Then we also have Dr. Andrews Atta-Asamoah. He is the head of African Peace and Security Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies, Pretoria, South Africa. And also an expert in terms of African peace, security, and governance specialist, a political analyst, a policy analyst, and a capacity building expert. Then we are looking forward to Mr. Amachi to join us. Mr. Fidelis Amachi Owusu, who is going to join us from Ghana, is an international relations and security analyst and CEO of DevSec Analytics Africa Limited, a senior conflict analyst for the Conflict Research Consortium. He will be joining us from Africa. I don't know why he hasn't joined us now, because I spoke to him not too long ago. Right. So, gentlemen, you are all welcome to this edition of the Sankofa African series. But before we proceed with today's discussions, we want our listeners to know that this program is for educational and operational purposes for policymakers in the state houses in Africa and those in the diaspora, the US, since we are focused on the US, to find a common ground and form a cohesive partnership in addressing the diverse security challenges, both internally and externally on the African continent. The overarching objective of the Sankofa African webinar is addressing great power and strategic relations, is to inform policymakers in state houses in Africa, right? Like I said, to find a common ground in addressing some of the issues, right? We want policymakers in state houses on the African continent and the US to note that Sankofa African is anchored on myriad of perspectives. So there may be differences of opinions from our guests based on their expertise, knowledge, and experiences. The difference in opinions does not necessarily mean perspectives and thoughts shared are wrong, but reflect a divergence of ideas to address security challenges facing the continent, right? So for the panelists, the program is an open discussion forum based on narratives. So you'll be asking why narratives? The use of narratives is premised on the Sankofa, the term Sankofa employed by Pan-Africanists all over the world to promote the notion that African peoples everywhere must go back to their roots in order to move forward. It also helps us to contextualize the issues to help our panelists to be mindful of bridging the gap between theory and practice and acknowledging differences in Western and African perspectives. Here, we tend to ask tough questions and to find what ethical solutions. So before we get into the topic for discussing today, we want our panelists to have an opening address. Whilst they are trying to have their opening address, they should take into consideration, right, the AU's ambition of the mantra, silencing the guns by 2030, right? So when you are giving your opening remarks, I want you to take that into consideration, right? Based on what you are seeing on the continent, do you see a situation whereby the next 6 years, there's a likelihood that most of the conflicts on the continent may be eradicated or may be minimized compared to what we are having now? Because in the new year, we're asking some of our panelists whether they are very optimistic or they are very, very pessimistic about 2024. And most of them were of the view that they are not optimists based on what you are seeing on the continent. So in your opening remarks, you have to take into consideration the AU mantra of silencing the guns by 2030. So let's start with you, Dr. Atta-Asamoah, your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akwe, for this opportunity and for the invitation. It's my first time participating, and so I appreciate the conversation. I already like the introduction you gave, and so I'm eager to see how it goes in terms of the exchanges. But I want to use my remarks to address the question you asked, whether Africa is going to be, the guns in Africa will be silent in 6 years, right? And to try and flag a number of things that should be within the context of the nuances that are necessary for understanding the challenges in Africa, but also the kind of key dimensions that have got to be in place if that is going to happen. Of course, I will then wrap up by addressing it directly, whether that is a possibility. So from where I sit, right, there are two dimensions to achieving that as a priority. Of course, within the broader vision to silence the guns in Africa, Africa wants to achieve that because as per the 50th anniversary OAU/AU Declaration of the African Leaders, what they said was that they committed to not bequeath to the next generation a continent that is saddled with all these challenges that we see. And so within that context, they then committed to say they want to silence the guns. Initially by 2020, 2020 elapsed. There were several gains made, but a lot of challenges remained. And so that was not realized. That subsequently was extended to 2030. And so the struggle to fulfill the goals of silencing the guns remain. As we speak, therefore, there are a number of things that are shaping whether by 2030 we will meet it, and therefore by the 6 years you said, whether it's a possibility. One dimension, and I always argue that the vision towards silencing the guns is a contestation between two sides. The dynamics in the threats domain, in terms of the nature of the threats from conflicts to terrorism to organized criminality, the nature of the state, the complexities around, diversity. It's a whole range of things. So the threats there have not stayed the same. They evolve. And as you know, after the Cold War, Africa really struggled with intrastate conflicts, right? It was not so much about violent extremism. But as we speak today, it is not just a question of violent extremism. It's a question of that plus the conflicts, plus weak states, plus it's a whole wide range of variables. So within the threats domain, we are experiencing a very dynamic interaction. And so the nature of the threats have not stayed the same. They change, they are dynamic, they are transnational, much more than what they were when the response side, the variables that we came up with as the response frameworks were, which is essentially the African peace and security architecture, made up of the African Standby Force, the use of Panel of the Wise, the governance architecture structures, the Peace Fund, and the whole array of things that were meant to address these things. And so the interaction between these, you have one that is pretty much stuck in its own history and the bureaucracies that come with it, which is the response side. And you have an incredibly dynamic threat dimension. And so there's always a mixed match. And so as much as we've registered successes to some extent in places like Somalia and others, the nature of the response frameworks have not been almost always commensurate with the nature of the threats. And so we find a capacity gap, which is where Africa continues to struggle with. And so even though there's the will for Africa to be able to do something, which is reflected in this notion of African solutions to African problems, the actual, when the rubber hits the road, there are challenges. And so in the next 6 years, this is where I come directly to your question. We are not likely going to be able to fix all the challenges. And I am saying that mindful of the fact that gains will be made, but a lot of that will be eroded by the changing nature of the threats themselves in the first place. But also a major factor which has to do with the failures of the African state will create new challenges, which will be new domains that the state will have to grapple with, which regional and continental actors will have to deal with. And one of the things I see coming is the nature of unemployment, growing inequality, managing youth expectation. And all of these will be things that will be on the horizon to be managed. And so where I sit, the guns will not be silenced. It doesn't mean the policy actors will go to sleep. They will be busy, but the issues will be far more overwhelming to the extent that the net effect of what they do versus what the situation is will seem like they've not done much, but it will be a question of the counterfactual. The situation would have been far worse if they did nothing. And so it will be more or less a definition of whether you be pro African to be able to find gains, or you'll be totally dismissive of African efforts to say these guys are just wasting space and money and they've not done anything. But the reality will be that a lot will be done, but there will still be a deficit of stability on the continent.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you. We appreciate that summary. Right, let's go to Dr. Marshall from Juba, South Sudan. Your opening remarks taken into consideration.
Good morning there. Good morning,
Yeah,
Ben, everyone's. Thank you, my South African brother, for that perspective that brought in the theories and the practice of what is going on in Africa in terms of stability, reduction in conflict, or increase in fragility. All those things are very important. I want to be more of realistic rather than to be either optimistic nor pessimistic. I just want to be realistic in the context of international relations. Number one, as my other brother has rightly put it, Africa is less likely to silence the guns in the next 6, 5, 10 years from now because of what I call state formations. It's a continuous process. And once you look at those states that are in the process of state formations, African countries, despite their independence 60 years ago, are still actually in the process of state formation. And this is what I mean. Our state in Africa, in reality, are not nation states. They are rather state nations. It is a state that compares. And when the Europeans crafted those states, they lumped so many in a group together. And that become a source of state contest. We have so many contested states. And there is no any examples more than the two Sudan. Okay? Dating back, Ghana got its independence in 1956. But it was in 1955, August 18, 1955, when the war between the North and the South broke out in the Sudan. Okay? And it was resolved in 2011 by dissolution of the Sudanese state and the formation of two countries, North and the South. And yet, the separation of the North from the South, nor the separation of the South from the North did not actually stabilize either of the two countries. Okay? And there's no any regions of Africa or any country of Africa or two countries that had actually given OAU or African Union more headache when it comes to conflict resolution than the two Sudan. And the thing that other professors lay them out actually speak volumes in our case. But beyond that, you go back to our history as Sudanese, the studies of the Turco-Egyptians in 1821. So the politics of the Sudan, whether you are talking of the North or the South, has always been around extraction. It is a politic of extraction. In the modern context, people like Alec Dewal and other scholars have referred it as the politic of transactions or kleptocracy, okay? But it has always been politic of extractions, whereby the Sudans, whatever going on in the Sudan, any major development that is taking place internally has to always be disrupted by external forces. And those external forces side with their internal supporters to subvert any type of development.
Dr. Marshall, can you hold on, right? Since this is the opening remarks,
okay.
Can you hold? can you hold on? Then we'll get back to the
Okay.
real issue. Okay. So,
Okay.
Lieutenant Tadikoka, you heard from Dr. Asamoah. You also heard from Dr. Mashar. What is your take generally about the conflict? Are you very optimistic? And do you think that that idea, that mantra of silencing the guns by 2030 is feasible?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me back to the show. And to all of the listeners, likewise, thank you for joining in. To Dr. Andy and Dr. Benjamin, it's great to see you and Glenn. So on your question of silencing the guns, I would say, and with the ambition for that to happen in 2030, I just don't I think that is realistic. So again, I don't think it's an objective because it doesn't meet some of the SMART principles, even though it's specific. I don't think it's achievable. I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think it's time bound. With everything that has evolved over on the African continent since not only since independence, but even before that, there is there's no realistic expectation that the guns will be silenced by the end of this decade. A couple points. One is that one of them, with Peter's remark, the nature of the response. I'm sorry, not Peter, but Andy. The couple of the mentions, Africa. Even though African leaders have what we refer to as the political will, they just don't have the wherewithal to accomplish it. And so one area they have, and why do I say that? All these conflicts, what do all of these conflicts represent? The absence of the proper deterrence for the conflicts themselves to exist. And so, and as far as the state, that's the very first in national security, and particularly for sovereigns of survivability, is you have to have the ability to deter any particular threat. And so, if from the start you're not able to do it, then you don't have control over the state, and you don't have control over sovereignty. So that would be one, and I think that's in many of the states they don't have the and that's hence you have conflict with Dr. Bashar. I think, and one of the so we're talking about conflict resolution, and a lot of that part of it is internal, interstate, in the case of I guess Sudan now, and also and not only between states, that is with Sudan and South Sudan. And so and with the conflict, there is with conflict resolution, particularly internal to the state, there is a from an American's perspective, that possibly means there's an absence of law and order. And so, and if you don't have law and order, then you're questionable about rule of law and those. Dr. Quay, you mentioned early on about all the policymakers, and with the policymakers, I think I look at policymakers with curiosity. And part of the reason I say the curiosity is that I think that's one of the major areas on the continent that in my observation is weak. Policymakers, both in the form of legislators and also in the form of government policymakers. So policymakers for national security, policymakers for internal security, like law enforcement policy, and so forth. And so, and then compound that with those policymakers, the next thing that comes to mind are policymakers across the whole continent. And so we're not just talking about one country, but you're talking about policymakers in 50 different countries. And that's a big task. So to make a long story short, No, I don't think that's realistic to think that the guns will be silenced by 2020, by 2030. Over.
Oh, all right, thank you very much. Yeah, we have Mr. Amache joining us now. Thank you for joining us. Right. So we're just doing an opening remark. So I want your opening remarks, but you have to tie it into the African Union or objective of trying to silence the gun by 2020. The question I want you to consider is that feasible? Right? Maybe there could be some efforts like Mr. Dr. Atta Asamoah said. Do you think that it is very possible for us to see the guns being silenced on the continent by 2030? Just your opening remarks. 1 minute, 2 minutes will be okay.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I've had a very bad network, so I couldn't join early enough, but then I'm fortunate to join. Firstly, I would like to say that as a continent, this is the second largest landmass on Earth. However, we have the highest number of countries at 54 sovereign and about 55, practical countries. There are so many countries in Africa, and most of them are multi-ethnic, or majority of them are multi-ethnic. Nigeria is running in the 200s, some are in the 300s and all that. So which means that you are not going to have unanimity in any particular country where one particular group seem to agree on a particular road to take to progress. So then the differences means that people are going to have different approaches to development and to statehood. This comes to the clash of ideas. I wouldn't say clash of civilization like Samuel Huntington, but there's clash of ideas in Africa. And so this is why I always talk about democracy. That look, democracy, we might not necessarily like it or we might not want it, but we need it, because then in this diversity, the only way to try to marry or to agree is to have dialogue, is to have freedom of expression, is to have free discussion in order to discuss the many issues that exist in each country. So silencing the guns in 2030 is largely not, I will not say it is impossible, but it is very ambitious. And I would urge that we should be more practical. Each country has its own or its peculiar challenges. And so to put 54 countries together and say we're going to silence the guns in 2030 is a good idea, but I feel that it is much more idealistic rather than realistic. And so if we are able to, for instance, I don't think that when that was talking about, that when they were talking about that, Benin, Republic of Benin was part of the discussion, because, I mean, there are no guns in Benin to silence. And countries like, let's say, even Ghana and even Kenya, where we had some issues, currently we found some stability. So definitely the situation is different from country to country. However, I feel that it is really, really ambitious to say that we are silencing the guns in 2030. That is just 6 years away. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to all of you. All right, so we've seen the first part of the narrative of the topic, which is why the guns are not silenced in Africa. Now, the other aspect of it, which is part of the topic, is the tragedy of the true Sudan. So now I'm going to create a narrative, right, to reflect what is happening in the Sudan, right? I will direct my first question to Dr. Masha, but let me read a narrative. When the secession actually happened in 2011, myself and Dr. Masha were students at Howard University, right? We were students in the same classroom, taking the same courses, but we had differences of opinions. But I just want to put this thing to bear, that in 2011, both of us were students at Howard University, and this was what was happening. Now, this is what somebody wrote. So in January 2014, Thomason S. Wasara, that means 3 years after the secession, and Al-Tayyib Zain Abdin, in an article titled Consequences of the Secession of the Southern Sudan on the Region, published by Codicera, which is in Senegal, on the future of the two Sudan, they stated, secession may be a rational choice if we look at the many grievances and atrocities committed under the name of keeping unity of the country. It appeared that the Sudanese people have sacrificed unity for the sake of attaining peace, because it is said that peace is better than unity. But that might not be the case, because although secession has taken place, but peace in the full sense is still to be reached, neither between the two countries nor within each of them. That is because neither Southern Sudan nor Northern Sudan are homogeneous societies. Both regions are and remain for a long time diversified in terms of tribes, cultures, and religions. Therefore, secession will not be the answer to their problems of diversity. If self-determination is to be applied as the only method of problem solving, we will end up in both North and South with many secessions and fragmentations in the future. So my first question to you, Dr. Mashar, a decade after the secession of the South from the North, and given the challenges both internally and externally within those countries, will it be fair to say that given the current happenings, we are experiencing a tragedy of the two Sudans, which the authors argue that secession would not be the answer to their problems of diversity and self-determination, as it is applied as the only method of problem solving? We will end up in both the North and South with many secessions and fragmentations in the future. Will you agree to the argument, given what is happening in the two Sudan?
Well, first, thank you for that question. One of the things that we should be able to understand from this conversation is the fact that there are more chances of secessions or fragmentation of the North more than in the South. You remember when Dr. John Garang used to argue, let's have one Sudan, indivisibles along sectarians. The North used to be dismissive on the fact that, you know, the South is more African and tribals. The North is more Islamic Arabs and united. Well, the North was only united against the South, but it was never in a position to maintain its own unity in absence of the North, or of the South. And that is also the same in the South. The South was only united against the North, but it was less likely to be united on itself, so that it builds a cohesive, more diverse state. And that's why in my open remarks, I said the guns are less likely to be silent in Africa, and particularly in the two Sudan, because of state formations. We are in the process of state formations. There are many ethnic communities in Nigeria, but there are more in both the North and the South in the Sudan. So, and those tribes or ethnic communities have never been brought together so that they feel like the part of the same unions in economic context, in administrative context, in the state formation processes. Those things have never taken place. And where we are in the two Sudan is a function of history. Again, the politic of the two Sudan is a politic of extraction dating back to Turco-Egyptians, and it came to Anglo-Egyptian in 1899, whereby the two parts were never meant to be one, but they were used interchangeably in the narrative of divide and conquer or divide and rule. So whereby the foreigners who happened to be Turco-Egyptian in those days used the North to extract slaves from the South, okay? And then when there were no slaves, they create the North and they create Khartoum, which became a station for slaves exchange. And then Port Sudan in place called Swakans on the Red Sea. Those were the two most important cities for transactions in humans transactions. And then when there was no slavery, they went for ivory, and then for cattle and animals. And then the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan came along looking for the great glory for the English. But again, they used the Egyptian the same way the Turkish had used the Egyptians to rule the Sudan until 1926. And then there was a rise of Arab Islamic dominations of the politics in the Sudan, whereby the North was exclusively defined to be Arab and Islamic, which is not true. And the South was defined as an African. And those were the power line in which the conflict were articulated. But there were other important factors that were never touched. In the North, there are more Africans in the communities in the North comparable to the South, okay? And those were lumped together. Even in the psychology of the South was shaped as if everyone in the North was Arab Islamic, which is not true. If you ask someone from Darfur today, will say no. And the key factor, the guy who is responsible for rapid support force is extremely light-skinned, more than the guy who is actually the military general, Buran. Ameti is more Arabs, but he called himself an African. See, it's a confusion of the definition of real identity in the Sudan, okay, in historical context. And Buran, who is actually more black, is the one called himself an Arabs. So in both North and the South, there are problems. And those problems are problem of state formations, wasn't by poverty, what we call in political science, most of the time, the problem of the developing countries are an holy trinity of poverty, ignorance, and diseases. And you could find those things in both North and the South, whereby there is a rise of collective transactional politics through kleptocratics and other methods of elite enrichments. And they forget about the masses that are part and parcel of the two countries, okay? And then you have the interest of foreigners in the two Sudan. Take, for example, in the South, there is a power struggle, international politics of China and the United States in the South over oil politics. And in the North, the commodity that is important are two, which fit the US versus Russia in port of the Sudan. And then the questions of the goals in the Sudan. And then it came back again to flashpoints. In 2023, tied it back again to the old Cold War politics of Ukraine versus Russia with the US advisors comparable to Vietnam's in the 60s. 71 advisors were sent to Kiev in 2022. And bring it back to Sudan, the same happens in March 2023. 70 advisors were sent from the United States, Washington to Khartoum over the issue of Russia engagements in the Red Sea area, especially Port Sudan. That becomes the contentions of conflicts. So you have US and China over oil politics in the Sudan, in the South, whereby the elites are rotating using democratizations if you are in opposition so that you are supported by the West. But you are not articulating democratization in the African context of the South Sudan contributing to stabilizations and reduction of conflict over a long period of time, okay? That is in the South. In the North, you have also elites who came in the post-Bashir. You have the old guys who used to rule the Sudan, who become the supporters of democratization, but they are lacking a lot of supporters within the country in the North. And you have the tension between the military and paramilitary. Now, whatever the Sudanese army did in the South during the war between the North and the South is exactly what is happening in the North. Because during the North-South war between the armed forces of the Sudan and the Sudan People Liberation, the armed forces of the Sudan,
Dr. Machar,
I'm tying it. I'm tying it to that so that it fit very well into African agenda of stabilization and reduction of conflict in the continent. But why is that actually failing in the Sudan? Now, the Sudan government support a lot of militias in the South to display the South. And now, by doing so, it had created a massive base of army that was not loyal to the state in the North. And when Bashir was put away, that army took over, subsuming the Sudanese army. And that is what had happened. That had triggered the conflict on April 15, 2023. And it made Sudan ungovernable more than the South. So to make it short, the Sudans that we used to know is not the Sudan of nowadays. There are more chances of state formations and fragmentations in the two Sudan. In the South, we still have more instability. The state is not yet consolidated. Sovereignty is so weak. In the North, which has been the state for a long time, those power lines that they have support to undermine the state in the South are now haunting in the North. In the context of Malcolm X, chicken have come home rules for the North, which is not also very good for the South.
All right, thank you very much. Let me come to you, Dr. Atasamoah. You listen to the argument that Dr. Machar is making, that there's a probability that there's going to be more fragmentation, but the fragmentation is going to happen mostly in the North. Would you agree? Would you agree with what the authors said, that the secession in 2011, that during the time of the secession, it was more about peace rather about unity? That was where the focus is. When the CPA was actually put in place in 2005. So the focus was more not about uniting the country, because there's a timeline that by 2011, this thing should be resolved. Would you agree with the assertion that it was more about peace and not unity? And because of that, that is why we are seeing all these things happening. And there's a likelihood that there's going to be more secession, as Dr. Machar indicated, in the South, in the North, sorry.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting narrative, right? I will start in two ways. First, I would problematize that link, the article establishes, right, between diversity and self-determination. And the fact, and because if I read the narrative, it seems to be kind of a linear kind of cause-effect relationship between the two. The Sudan situation was more complex than that, because if you trace it all the way from, the 1955 onset of the conflicts, complexity, Anyanya 1, Anyanya 2, if you look at all these, self-determination was not necessarily the one that was on top. It was not a priority as such. The question about self-determination, remember that even the whole, what Machar mentioned, Garang's push for one Sudan, the new Sudan concept, did not prioritize self-determination at all. Neither was it all a question of diversity. I think the issues were more complex than that. But if you look at the history, right, attempts were given for unity to be prioritized much more than self-determination. And so those who push for self-determination, their narrative started gaining ground from 1994, when if you check, when the split between the SPLA became really clear. And so the like of Dr. Machar, that not you, the vice president, who were very initial proponents of this whole concept of, of self-determination, did not necessarily initially gain traction. And so it was even in the CPA 2005, the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, you will notice that self-governance came first, because they still wanted to make unity attractive, subject to several other things. So the self-determination question came up as a result of the fact that unity was not something that the leaders of the North sort of prioritized as such. And so it was more of a case of a last-minute search for divorce, because that is what was considered as an option going forward. All the chances that were given for unity to be attractive did not necessarily become as attractive as it is. And so for me, from where I sit, speaking conceptually, I feel that giving unity up, for peace was worth it, because there's nothing that can, when unity does not guarantee, right? And I'm choosing my words here advisedly. When unity does not guarantee existence and sustainability of life, it is only an existential question that one will want to opt for a divorce, as it happened in the case of South Sudan and Sudan. Now, the tragedy in that context was not necessarily the choice of self-determination, but the tragedy was about the fact that the preoccupation with the conflict on both sides, denied both sides the experience of effectively managing the issues of diversity that existed on both sides. In the North, they had, the freedom to use all the resources from the South, to help develop the North at the expense of the South. And within the South, the preoccupation of fighting a common enemy, as Dr. Garang said, now my brother Garang here, not the vice president, Dr. Machar said, yes, Dr. Machar said, the tragedy of that preoccupation was a glue that kept the South together. It was not necessarily so much, and so they did not learn how to live together as different people from the different tribes. Now the reality has set in, and so you're experiencing a kind of a tragedy of the lack of experience on the part of the South to be able to, keep it together, manage the diversity together. But that said, it's also the history of many of our countries. How many African countries emerge from independence and instantly are adept at managing their own affairs? It's a learning process. You need to go through the ropes. You have missteps, and it's only when you learn the right lessons out of it that you establish a formidable country that always has a narrative that says we don't want this to happen again. We've had it in Rwanda. Many countries have a bloody past. But based on that, a new narrative, a new construction around statehood is built where you're saying we don't want to have this experience again. That is where South Sudan is. For me, South Sudan's tragedy will begin if they don't look at what happened from 2013 onwards and build in themselves a narrative that says, let's come together and let's not go back there. That will be the beginning of real tragedy. What I see now are all, the symptoms of a young country learning how to manage its situations, its dynamics in a much more complex way. Remember that the South Sudanese leaders, right, have a much more sophisticated political construction, I feel, much more stronger than the state. The very young state is capable of managing. And so we are seeing that mismatch. It's only when they have strong institutions emerging and all the other related aspects that they'll be able to figure it out. It comes with time. And many of these countries, including Ghana and all of these, have had years where it was really terrible. The tragedy, in my view, will happen if they don't look at it and fix it. On the part of the Northern Sudan, if I could wrap up quickly, I think the tragedy is more, as the narrative is now and what is prevailing now, it's more a tragedy of the sudden exit of a dictator who managed the state in a certain way and the struggle of not being able, to hold the country together. Remember that Bashir had an extremely deep state, almost in all aspects. Now, the contestation between Burhan and Hemeti reflects how he managed the army itself. He managed it in a way that he was the only one who had the kind of oversight he needed. And so once that was removed, there's mistrust, there's contestation, mixed with diversity issues, so it becomes much more complex. So Sudan's tragedy now is much less a question of the self-determination of South Sudan. It's much more about the exit of Bashir and how that was managed. And even from where I sit, when the transitional agreement almost elevated the RSF close to what the army is, you essentially created a de facto situation where Hemeti had his eyes on power and so wants to go for it. And so I would not blame all of this on the self-determination question. I will blame it much more on the several complexes, part of which Dr. Machar has explained, playing out. But let's not take out the fact that many of these countries are very young. Of course, not enough. But if you take out the fact that Sudan is emerging from an extreme case of dictatorship, it's also a very young country in this in the search for the kind of modern state we want. And so These are tragedies that the states will have to grapple with, which is part of the narrative we need to nuance.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's come to you, Mr. Amachi. Listening to Dr. Masha and Dr. Atta-Samoah, we already know the challenges already before the succession was supposed to take place. We know the difficulties and challenges of the various African countries, right? It's not nothing new. What is happening in the north and what is happening in the south are things that African countries do face on a regular basis. Can you make the argument that whilst the succession was about to take place, they did not factor into that they were going to experience these challenges after the succession? Unmute your microphone. Unmute your microphone. Dr.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. As I said that there is something I have noticed in Africa, and mostly we overlook, is the individual factor. Most of the conflicts in Africa goes beyond the group level, where we talk about ethnicity. It goes beyond the institutional level, where you talk about maybe the military or some bureaucracy or some paramilitary force and all that. Mostly, it is the individual factor. The determination of individuals to overstay and to manipulate the system to entrench themselves in office. That is the problem we face. And mostly, we don't talk about it. Why am I saying this? Even look at al-Bashir. Al-Bashir, as my previous speakers have said, had manipulated the system to his benefit. The use of the Janjaweed in Darfur, and later, and in doing all this, he was trying to weaken the regular forces of Sudan. We saw that in Libya, despite the kind of love some people have for Gaddafi and all that, Gaddafi actually strengthened his guard and his immediate loyalists in terms of the military and made the general Libyan army relatively weak in order to exercise that control. He had come through coup, he didn't want that. In Sudan, we saw that, where the RSF was made very strong, and in Africa, the military is essentially the infantry and not air power. And now we see it in Sudan, where the SAF is not able to take control from the RSF, because the RSF, from the right on, or from the onset, had been made the infantry power in Sudan under the direct control of al-Bashir. Now, I will say this because historically, that has been the case. Let's look at Cote d'Ivoire versus Ghana. From the 1960s, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire had started off, and Ghana had independence 3 years earlier than Cote d'Ivoire did. At the end of the day, when Houphouët-Boigny took office, he had experienced stability. But on the other hand, Ghana had a lot of political turmoil where the militaries come, take over, and then hand over, take over again, and all that. That kind of intermittent or that kind of instability, political instability. But in the same vein, Cote d'Ivoire was experiencing stability under one man. And everybody was praising it, that, well, Houphouët-Boigny has been able to stabilize the country. But at the end of the day, what happened? When he left the scene, and he did not really have that control of one person was absent, Cote d'Ivoire moved from being one of the most stable countries in Africa and West Africa to experiencing 2 civil wars and a coup d'etat. And the kind of turmoil that happened to Cote d'Ivoire saw Ghana being mentioned as an example rather than Cote d'Ivoire. But in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, and even the 90s, early 90s, Cote d'Ivoire was a shining star, one of the shining stars of Africa in terms of stability. So in South Sudan, what is the role of the leader, the current leader? Why does he keep wanting to run for elections? Why can't they keep a cap? In fact, to me, even Rwanda is not a good news to me, as many people claim in Africa. No, it is not. To me, it is not. Because within Rwanda, there are differences there. We cannot close our eyes to the Hutu-Tutsi dichotomy in the country. In that vein, even no matter how messianic you are as a leader, there's a point you're supposed to hand over. Paul Kagame running in 2024 again, to me, is meaningless. Because in the long run, no matter how effective you are, if institutions must be as strong as your time in office, or your time in office is going to be run concurrently with strong institutions, then when you are not in office, what happens to the institutions? So in this vein, I would say that in many ways, the individual aspect, because my previous speakers have spoken a lot about the institutional level and all that, but the individual role, the individual level of analysis must be paid attention to. In Kenya, recently I was ranking states in Africa, geopolitics and all that. I gave it to Kenya instead of Rwanda. Why? Not because Rwanda is a smaller state, but because in Kenya, they are doing it while presidents have term limits. Uhuru left without supporting his vice, but his vice won the elections and he handed over. That is the kind of news we want in Africa. When that is set in motion, situations like in Sudan, North Sudan, in Sudan, Republic of Sudan, we saw al-Bashir staying on. If he had handed over earlier, there would have been some challenges. But then democracy is such that different ideas, fresh ideas come in and it moves. Look at the moves that Abiy Ahmed started when he took office in Ethiopia after a long time rule under Meles Zenawi. And after he died and the transition was so rough, he took over, he made peace with Eritrea. It won him some Nobel Prize, but currently we see some challenges. Those challenges are necessary, but if he decides to overstay, we are likely to go back to the days, because now he started, we see his moves, some of his moves are becoming controversial. That is how power works. And so the leadership turnover, procedural leadership turnover must be instilled in Africa. If not, we are going to continue to have this situation. Before I wrap up, let's take the DRC. Joseph Kabila was there. He kept postponing elections, and the country was on a tenuous situation. Currently, we have Tshisekedi. The elections they held was not perfect, but we have a president who has a term limit, and after that, he's supposed to leave. Despite the challenges, when the system keeps changing leaders, things take shape. And I think that is what will ensure stability. And when that is done, tribes and ethnic groups are not going to resort to violence, because they know that whether by alliance or by themselves, some people from their kinsmen, some of their kinsmen can one day take power. And in that hope, there's this kind of some assurance or some hope in security and stability of the country. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Right, so let me get your thoughts on the tragedy of the two Sudans. Right now, you are an expert. You've been on the continent for a long time. You've seen secessions come and secessions go, and when the countries succeed, they tend to have a lot of challenges. Right now, I remember in 2011 when this thing was taking place, we had an argument that power is not like a piece of cake that you easily divide it and split among people. Now, we were saying back then that, okay, what the situation in the Sudan can be considered as power, right? Now you split it. Now, if you split it and people have two halves, now they are going to struggle. People on one side are going to struggle over half, and that group of people are also going to struggle over and half, and that is going to create more chaos, right? Would you agree with that assertion that what is happening now after, let's say, a decade, and the challenge that both countries are going, would you consider that to be a tragedy, right? Based on the fact that the focus was more on what? On self-determination rather than peace. Mr. Lieutenant Walker, given your experience and what we are seeing now in both countries.
Me?
No, Lieutenant Walker.
Yeah, can you come? I'm sorry. Can you come back to me with that question? I was I had a different train of thought, but go ahead.
Yeah, what I'm asking is that we know historically, you are an expert. You've seen what has happened on the continent for so many years in terms of secessions. When countries succeed, they tend to have some of these challenges. And like I said, back then when the secession was taking place, we were looking at it in terms of power. We say, well, power is not a piece of cake where you share it among people. Now, let's assume it's power. The North has taken half of the piece of cake. The South has also taken half piece of cake. Now, the North is now fighting of half piece of cake, and the South is now fighting over half piece of cake compared to when both of them were fighting over a whole cake. So seeing what is happening now, right? These things were predictable, that they were going to have this problem, despite the fact that we know that what they are doing, nation building, state formation, and things like that. These things are about to happen. And is it fair to consider what is happening a tragedy?
Well, I think the short and simple answer is absolutely it's a tragedy, and so but the tragedy covers many of the areas that the other panelists have addressed, and I will contribute. And I think part of when you approach it with the power, we are. That's the question. So the whole question for all the countries is power, and similarly here in the U.S., it's with the 2024 U.S. presidential election. It's about power. Who will control the power, and so that is a state phenomenon. Controlling the power. There is I think a difference is that how different states are, the superstructure, if you will, of the state, and how the power is. If you have the North and the South, if they want raw power, then that's what they're currently pursuing. If they you can have hard power and you can have soft power. So there are a number of different ways to skin the cat. But I do think it kind of goes back to what Professor Ada Asama mentioned on a couple of occasions, and it gets to, and also with Professor Mashar, and in state formation. Someone was talking about station states, so I'm talking about nation states, and Dr. Arasomo was talking about managing their own affairs. From a different perspective, what I see is Africa as it currently is, and its relatively recent legacy. So the question is, okay, so here we are. We started it at one point, let's say 50 years ago, let's say 100 years ago, and now we're at the present point of 2024. And what do we have? What is the legacy? The legacy, as Brother Owusu says, is about the individual. And so you have to kind of take that into consideration, is that many African countries are about the individual. It's not about the polity. It's not about democracy. It's not about others. It's about individual pursuit of raw power, bare strength. And so that's what you have seen. And to me, that kind of represents the state nation rather than the nation state. And so the question for Africa is, okay, well, what does a nation state look like? I have said before is that you have to, what is the foundation? And so the foundation in many of the states as they currently exist are state nations. And so what might be a potential nation state? And from my perspective and background, living in the U.S. and the U.S., so from its birth was a democracy, and so and as a democracy is kind of ruled and controlled by the people, and so and all of the the colonies in the U.S. and then the states and the cities in the U.S. It's all people centric. The U.S. democracy has the numerous branches of government for what? Checks and balances. And so in Africa, what are the checks and balances of in many African countries, you see, the executive as being the preponderance of the balance of power in these states. Where are the legislature? Where is the judicial? And how are those two branches checking the executive? It's absent. And so a lot of this has to do with, as Professor Mashar has says, it is the state nation, and also this is it's in a state in transition. And I think as they pursue the transition, you should look at the foundation. And many of the things that in the U.S., because our chief executive is under so much hot water with the rule of law, many of the courts say, okay, what did the founders think? What did the folks who wrote the U.S. Constitution think? And so you don't hear about that in Africa. You don't hear about, okay, well, what's the Constitution say? Where is the Constitution? How does it exist? How's it applied? And so go back to the foundation and build from there. I would add that again with the Sudan dictatorship, and so for many years, and so why the dictatorship. The general public is fed up with dictatorships. If anything, if there's going to be a silencing of the guns, the silencing is guns are going to come from the general population. It will be the public uprising to say we have had enough. Enough is enough, and then that may spread. Back in the 2015 timeframe, we thought that the Arab Spring would be that kind of public uprising that silences the guns. But it did not spread, and so but I don't know. There may be another a Sudan Spring or something else that has it. The question is when you have public arrest, it has to be okay. What's next? What is the model? What roadmap are we taking? We know where we come from. We know what the legacy is, and we know how we have got where we are. That's fine. What is the new paradigm shift? How do we go from where we were to where we want to be? And the last point I will make is that it will be it is get the people, the public involved. You don't hear much about that. Get many of these African thinkers and writers to come back and revisit these constitutions and make sure they are airtight. And what some of the things that the constitutions must say, it has to have the checks and balances. The Constitution should put the check and balance on regimes. And so then the question is, okay, if a person wants to remain in power and he wants to do it extrajudicially, then you have to have consequences. And so if people don't have consequences for staying in power, then the Constitution and the laws are worthless and useless. And so in ECOWAS, with the flood of recent coups, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, Mali, every time folks say, well, okay, well, oh, we're getting serious about this. We're going to kind of activate the ECOWAS standby force. But you can't do it because the ECOWAS standby force does not have the wherewithal to hold these individuals accountable. You have to kind of look at the foundation and then kind of build up from there to go forward and try to advance. Right now, you have with the conflicts, particularly in Sudan, South Sudan, will continue. They are what? Continue on course and speed and pace. And so there is no on the moment on the horizon a favorable result for the situation. And I with the state formation, take a serious look at it. Okay, what do you want from South Sudan? I don't know. I haven't studied it. I don't live in there, so I don't see it every way. But the question is that what is it succinctly in writing that you have? And my last point would be on the documentation aspect of it. And so there is the African tradition is oral communication, you know, and a verbal oral society mostly. Document things, put them in writing, and let the public see what the writing is, and then kind of do a monitoring evaluation of the progress. So with that said, I will thank you much.
All right, thank you very much. So I think that all of us can agree that what is currently happening is very tragic, right? And mostly these things were foreseeable, and we will give all kinds of reasons. So now I want us to shift our attention to silencing the gun, to look at the internal variables, right, that are causing the conflict in these countries. So I'm going to create a narrative, right, on silencing the guns in terms of the drivers of the conflict in these two countries. So this will be directed to Dr. Asamoah. Then the other panelists can react on that. So on March 30th, 2023, the UN Security Council, during its 9299th meeting, Special Advisor of Africa to the UN Secretary General tells Security Council in a debate, silencing the gun on the topic, root causes of conflict in Africa, addressed beyond traditional response. The advisor was Christina Duarte. She said, unfortunately, the African perspective has been insufficiently incorporated in global discussions on peace and security on the continent. Let me repeat that. She said, unfortunately, the African perspective has been insufficiently incorporated in global discussions on peace and security on the continent. She emphasized the importance of addressing the internal and root causes of conflict in Africa beyond the traditional response, which only tackled the symptoms, adding that only development will create the capacities that will help African countries overcome the peace and security challenges that we have, right? So she has mentioned internal and external and African perspective. Now, I want us to skip some of the things that she said. My question to you, Dr. Asamoah, is what are the root causes of the conflicts in both two countries, the South and the North? What are the internal causes of the conflict?
Are you restricting it to Sudan in this particular case?
Both of them. We want to focus our attention only on the internal. They will move to the external. So you have probably like 5 minutes to look at. It depends on whichever. If you want to focus your attention on the internal in Sudan, that's fine. So whichever way you want to take it, so that the other panelists will also have the opportunity to look at the other one. Let's focus on the Sudan, so that Dr. Machar will look at the South Sudan. What are the internal root causes of the conflict in the Sudan?
Thank you very much. I think if you there are a number of things we've mentioned, particularly Dr. Machar and myself, since we started analyzing the two Sudans, which all come into play, right? But I want to start with the Sudan's current situation, because of course we can go back, but at the end of the day, we are interested in how do you fix what is happening now. I will trace it principally to a number of things. First, to the Bashir regime, right? And I'm looking at the situation as it is now. And the way Bashir ran that country, right? The divisions, exploitation of marginalization, playing different groups against each other. If you look at the role that the RSF, for instance, the Janjaweed played in Darfur, and the fact that he used a certain group to try and do his dirty bidding in a particular part of the country. And by so doing, you are not just only on the onslaught in terms of human rights abuses, you are creating tensions between various groups, between aspects, of the country, which makes it very, very difficult to contain. One. Second is how he divided and ruled the army. If you look at how he handled the national security infrastructure on one side and how he handled the different units of the army in terms of how he equipped them, the kind of loyalties he created just around himself, to the extent that he was the only one at a certain point who knew what was happening in various units. And so they were each used to check on each other, a kind of an army that was essentially Bashir's, right? And look at the fact that then when he leaves, what kind of infrastructure do you have? Do you have a state infrastructure or something that was loyal to an individual? Which highlights some of the challenges that my colleague pointed about Rwanda, for instance. We've seen something similar in Libya already, and the kind of dangers that he's pointing to. So these are realities. Also related to the fact that the biggest thing he had to have all of these running had to do also with money coming in, right, from oil resources. Fast forward, South Sudan exits, huge chunk of the resources exit. And so there was an attempt to even diversify the Sudanese state and to increase the production of gold, for instance. And so if you look at the figures, gold production went up, agricultural production went up, trying to offset the loss that they had with South Sudan exiting. Again, that brings in the first narrative and the kind of discussions we had. Struggling. And so all of these were at play when Sudan started to struggle with the economic figures. Then we saw the protests coming up. The protests then feeding off deep-seated structural issues of corruption, deep-seated structural issues about marginalization, deep-seated marginalization of the peripheries, which in a way also had to do with the extent to which some of the ethnic groups were played against each other, the lack of development in the peripheries, and the fact that everything was in Khartoum. At the time South Sudan was getting independent, more than 90% of the electricity that was produced in Sudan were largely concentrated in the north. South Sudan was essentially left off. But even if you take out South Sudan, the Kordofans were essentially marginalized. The Eastern Sudan crisis around marginalization was there. So Sudan itself was a hotbed of several issues, right? Now, Bashir mastered how to keep it together. He suddenly removed. And in his place, you have as a result of the protests, contestations within the civilian front, as well as the mistrust within the army. And so holding it together became very, very difficult for Hamdok, right? And on top of that, Hamdok was supposed to fix an economic situation which Sudan was in, and the lack of the necessary support the country had. Remember, in the midst of having to fix all of this, he was negotiating, taking Sudan out of the whole sanctions that Bashir had worked the country into. And so the flow of resources were limited. The army did not trust the fact that the civilian leadership will work to protect their interests, because there's that military economic complex, which is also has created interest for several actors to benefit from. And so you had an army coming up, them blaming the civilian side divided along several political lines. And so a country that went as slow as it can be in terms of creating cohesion and becoming more and more fragile, to the extent that I was not surprised when the army staged the coup. Why? Because the country has a long history of military rule. And so they could not even think about the fact that the civilian leadership was going to come and how that was going to be sustainable in itself, right? And so these are the things that have led to where we are. Again, if you look at how Bashir handled the army, he used the likes of ad hoc measures like Janjaweed, which is a precursor to the RSF, we know it, to do his dirty bidding. But by so doing, he propped certain key individuals one of which is the Houthi we know today. All of these contesting to be part of the center of the state, which is essentially where the army now wants to be and where Houthi also wants to be. But think about it this way. When all of these are failing to hold, the central holding factor of the Sudanese state has become very, very fragile. And so this is where we are. But I blame also how the whole transition was handled. If you look at how the transition was handled, the negotiation process, I had raised series of issues about it. How do you mention the RSF, which was a paramilitary entity, close and in the same line on the face of the paper alongside the army, almost giving Houthi a place in the Sovereignty Council, right? And with someone who was power hungry, had access to resources, gold and links in several parts of the country, it was only natural within political realm that he would want to go for the main thing, right? And so these are all things that have set up the Somalis, the Sudanese state as it is now to be more and more fragile. My fear then is that the construct that is now the situation, we are lacking a gluing factor. Around which entity do you reconstruct the state around? Because this conversation we are having about state, nation state, and state nation, you essentially need an individual or an entity to be the fulcrum around which you rally the state. Now that is lacking because Sudan hasn't had the opportunity to groom all of this. On top of all of this, put in political Islam, right? Which has also been part of Sudan's history. And you get a cocktail of everything that can go wrong in Sudan. So if I can summarize, therefore, all these variables come around the following: mismanagement of diversity, dictatorships, corruption, marginalization, right? Where you have actual political contestation in a way that the systems are not able to prop the state. And so the state has given way in the way we are seeing it. And I feel that we need to bring all these complexities into the table and add on the external interferences from the east and the west, including the region itself, because there are several actors in the region that have interest in Sudan. And that is when we see the definition of what caused the conflict in Sudan at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. I was expecting to move to Dr. Mashal for him to, since he's from South Sudan, for him to discuss it. But let me go to Mr. Machi, right? If you listen to the presentation that Dr. Asamoah just did, if you look at what's happening internally in the Sudan, you can see the same thing being played out in South Sudan, right? If you look at Salva Kiir, right, he is behaving more or less like al-Bashir. He's been accused of regionalism, tribalism, right? You talk about the focus is on Juba and not in the other regions. He's being accused of what? Using ethnic tribes. He's accused of using national security, apparatus to threaten people, incarcerating people. So what is happening internally in the Sudan is refurbishing itself in South Sudan, whereby you have a leader who was more or less in the same status as al-Bashir doing the same thing. So it's like, what is it that we don't get right as we try to resolve this problem? We've seen this internal dynamics played out in the north, and it's currently being played out in the south. What do you say to that? Unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much, sir. And then I thank Dr. Asamoah for demystifying the North. What is happening is is just something that is very common in Africa. And so if you took the North, or let's say Sudan, you realize the kind of manipulation that an individual will use to stay in power for decades. In fact, many attempts were made on or to remove al-Bashir, but he was always able to garner the kind of infrastructure, the power infrastructure he had built around himself to always repel that. In the same way with the South Sudan, where the leader is playing to the Dinka Nuer gallery or narrative in order to stay. So his ethnicity are going to feel that without him, there is no way they are going to benefit from the national cake. And that is always the narrative. They create that insecurity for their own ethnicities. So they feel that, well, for us to be very relevant in this country, for us to get a fair share of the national cake or what we deserve, this leader must be there. Any change in leadership is going to deny us of the kind of influence or the kind of rights that we have to the resources. And so when this happens, then the leader becomes a demigod in the country where people support him regardless of his performance, regardless of the corruption, regardless of mismanagement. People will still support such leaders. So in South Sudan, we have that happening. In fact, he's always using negotiations, prolonging and postponing elections, trying to adopt tactics that could only be seen as delay tactics to stay on. At every opportunity, that is what happens. Now in South Sudan, now the oil pours in. There is sovereignty. He's accepted in the various capitals across the world. So he's not leaving. He feels that he fought in the wilderness and so deserves more than anyone else. But there are other leaders like Machar and other people who equally fought. And as Doc said earlier, Machar and co were the people who actually started this. They were before seen as more radical because they wanted real sovereignty. But today, he is on the periphery because Salva Kiir is not going to allow him. And that is where I have a problem. In Niger, and I'll keep expanding some of the examples I gave because I think that Doc has already expatiated on the region, the country. So if you took Niger, the current coup that we had, what happened? This is a country that is dominated by majority ethnicities like Hausa and others. For the first time, they had someone from a very minority group becoming president. And that is the president who was removed. Now that president is removed. So what happens? So the minority in the country continuously feels that, well, we are never going to have any fair access to power in this country. So they resort to arms. And it takes a lot of effort to convince them otherwise, because they have seen it, that when a minority president was there, he was removed. So that is what happens in other countries. And so in Sudan, that's what we are seeing, that the man is using this ethnic dominance to stay on. So at the end of the day, it is not the issue of ethnicity, it's the issue of an individual who has decided to stay and playing that game to stay on. Now, let's take Somalia. Somalia is one of the countries with ethnic unanimity, homogeneity, where all Somalians are Somalis. So you would expect that there was supposed to be some unity. But then again, there's another identity. Clan becomes the dividing factor. That, well, we all speak the same language, we are all of one ethnicity, but we belong to different clans. And if you check Sudan and Somalia currently, that is their point of division. So the identity politics, which in every situation takes time to build, because in Ghana, we've had our problems, where some people say when Ashanti is in power and so he's dominating, and Ebe is in power, so his people are dominating and all that. We've had it. Nigeria has it. But in these countries, because of democratization, it has evolved. And we find people from different ethnicities. We've had a Gonja, we've had an Ebe, we've had an Ashanti, Fanti, and currently an Achim, who are minorities within the Akan group, ruling. Before, you look at the bigger groups and not from the minority. So over time, if South Sudan, the system is allowed to run like what Mr. Todd said earlier, institutions become superior to individual whims and caprices, then you would have the system running. So you are right in saying that what happened in Sudan is exactly what Salva Kiir is doing. Now, look at the RSF, Dagalo. Dagalo did not have any formal education. He was just in the East there, coming from some privileged group.
We'll come back to that in our next narrative. All right. All right. Since before we go to Lieutenant Korka, right? I want to come back to Dr. Atasamoah. I want you to give us the external drivers, right? The external drivers of the conflict. If you can briefly do it for both countries, right? In terms of what the regionalism and those Eastern and Western powers playing out, then we'll get a comment from Tab Korka. We'll visit the article you published on LinkedIn. All right, so let's hear from you. What could be the external power play in these two countries?
I will not mention names for very obvious reasons, but I mean there are several layers of it. You know that for a long time, countries, the Troika has had a very good, they've been pen holders essentially, right? When it comes to Sudan issues. And so we're talking about the US, we are talking about UK, and to some extent Norway. These have been pen holders. And so when it comes to pushing their files at the Security Council, these countries have been huge players. And so whichever way it goes at the Security Council, whether you want to blame it as being slow or fast, you can lay it at the door of particularly in the superpower, the US, right? I feel that the transition period between President Obama's time, right, and to President Trump, the momentum was lost, particularly when it comes to the file on South Sudan. The momentum was lost. That has had a bit of impact also, even in terms of how fast the UN was able to move, and several things in South Sudan. I'm not too sure whether that kind of slowdown has had a huge impact in terms of where we are in South Sudan. But these countries, if you're looking at that layer, that's one layer. You also need to look at the relationship between the Horn and the Middle Eastern countries. Remember that Sudan sits when if you look at the both religious interface and interracial interface coming from the north down to sub-Saharan Africa, Sudan sits as a very crucial middle belt in that sense. And that is how come even the north-south dynamic, part of the narrative, you had those that went with a very monocausal dimension of Arab versus sub-Saharan Black African conflict. So that is there, and it will forever be part of the narrative that goes on, informing the role that several actors play in these countries. But if you look at the north now, you have the Arab world, the relationship between Houthi and some of the countries in the Arab world, the relationship between Burhan and some of the countries up north like Egypt, and some of the countries in the Arab world as well, which also connects to the role that part of the RSF played in the ongoing conflict in Yemen and other places, which has given them a certain level of access, right? Which means that whatever is happening in Sudan, all of these have interest to go well or not. Now, so that layer is there. Then you also have to bring in the sub-Saharan Africa, the IGAD region. Several countries have interest in what happens. When we say interest, we are not necessarily saying fomenting trouble. We are saying that they all want to be part of calling for the shots in the country. And so even South Sudan now has a role to play when it comes to trying to determine the way forward in the north. And interestingly, President Salva Kiir, if you put aside all his weaknesses in managing his own country, has emerged as someone who understands the system in the North and has been ready to be part of trying to fix the North. And that is how come even the IGAD's response included him, and he's played a pretty positive role having come this far. But you have several countries like Uganda, you have Kenya, you have various countries that you cannot leave them out because they've all played crucial roles, both in trying to bring the self-determination to the South and in trying to bring about the CPA. And so all these countries have a role to play. On top of the fact that if you bring in the Nile question, right, then it becomes more complex because Sudan, when it comes to the Nile matrix and the complexities around it and the source of the Nile, Sudan has a role to play. Again, whatever happens in Sudan mimics a lot of what happens in several other countries. I saw that Owusu you were pointing to the fact that there's a similarity in how Bashir ran his Sudan and what is emerging in the South in terms of the relationship between the J1, which is the presidency, the national, the NSS, which is the, what do you call it? The national intelligence and the power they operate, the army and the political party, right? And even aspect of how certain elements were very, very key in the NCP, you know, having played a role around the leadership in South Sudan and the kind of power mix. The similarities are clear. And so sometimes you can easily see how things can go wrong. The role of the NSS. And I think one of your narratives even mentioned, you know, the statement to Congress and how that is a very accurate narrative of what the reality is. And so these are the layers. For me as an African, sometimes when we want to finger point to the North, external influences, we always rush to look at the role of the West, but sometimes you also need to look at the regions, the countries in the regions. It's the case in Somalia as well, the role of the countries in the region, and even countries that have what it takes to play a role, but might not necessarily be maximizing it. If you go to South Sudan, one country that can play a huge role is South Africa, because of that liberation kind of history. And so you have South Sudanese leadership looking and respecting so much the experience of South Africa, for instance. Has South Africa maximized it in the interest of South Sudan? Maybe not necessarily yet. And so there are several layers that you can look at it. And then on top of the fact that you need to look at those that are supplying small arms and light weapons into the situation, right?
Yeah, because, well, I think we will do that in that narrative, I presented that narrative, right? So let me go to Lieutenant Adcock. You have had so much experience, right, on the continent. We know the power play, the geopolitics between the West and the East, right? But we know after the Cold War, Russia was gone. It was the United States which was trying to influence whatever their interest on the continent. Now, but what happened between the South and the North brought in another key player, which is Saudi Arabia, which is Egypt on one side supporting what? The North. Then you have Egypt, Ethiopia also playing a role in terms of its relationship, right, because it's more African. So it also supported the South. So we've seen all these dynamics being played out, right? So how do we get an African perspective? Because from what she said, Christina Duarte said, we should bring an African perspective. Once we see all these things has played out in the past and it's continue playing out, and the AU is standing by, IGAD is standing by, they're trying to hold all kinds of peace agreements and things like that, and yet still things are not working. What is it about us that we know the sources of the problem, we know the power dynamics, we know the regionalism being played, and yet still we can't figure things out?
Thank you for that. I would, and for Professor Asaboa, with the external drivers. I appreciate him and talking about the U.S. Security Council and the U.S. and superpowers, and then going down to shared responsibility, specifically regionally and so forth. And thank you, and also for your question about how these things have evolved over time. Then kind of nailing down specifically to the matter of with the African perspective on inefficient incorporation. I think I would offer that there's the aspect of the African incorporation that is maybe overlooked is that Africa Africa needs to, as I mentioned earlier, is to put it down and to document it, and then to stick with it. What we have seen, and what I have seen over time, and what I have experienced in several countries, is that the phenomena of Africa not formulating its internal perspective. And in the absence of formulating an internal perspective, it then is subjected to what donors have to offer. And so, and many African countries are quite receptive to whatever they are offered. And there are times when what they are offered is not what's in their best interest, what is best for them. And so, nevertheless, because many African countries consider themselves as donor countries, they readily kind of take what it is that people are offered. Give you an example. The U.S. has the U.S. can offer, particularly in the military or the defense instrument of power, offers extensive security assistance continent-wide. It has offered it across the Sahel, as we know. It has offered it throughout the East, and also throughout the East, specifically for Somalia, and then for Kenya, and so on and so forth, and also in the West for many of the countries there. But the issue is what is it that is and however, the U.S. Department of Defense, has and also with the U.S. Department of State, because it's actually state that implements this bilateral assistance, is that they have a very specific assortment of things to choose from, and they will offer those to many African countries, and the African countries will take them whether they need them or not, whether that's best for them or not, and so forth. And so that would be one aspect of the African perspective. The Africa, the author needs to offer a perspective on the security. So and it's specifically in Sudan and South Sudan. What is it that you think you want? Here's what we have, and then also do as when I was in most recently in the Gambia, I specifically coordinated everything that any country wanted to offer for security assistance in the Gambia. So I saw exactly the whole range of possibilities, and so you're not limited to one specific country, but you have a lot. The key though is being having a plan to for everything to fit in and then to move forward. So that would be one. On the other aspects of in getting back to power, keep in mind, and for U.S. and when we talk international, so for a nation state going to in the international game, you know, the global community talks about these instruments of power: diplomatic, information, military, and the economy. Most of the focus in Africa, or some of it, not most of it, but what I hear is political power, and particularly, you know, the national cake. And so starting from the top with the national cake and then working down. I think in the U.S. we start from the bottom and work up. So, you know, and the cake begins in the individual household. And then the individual household joins into the community, and then the community has that community cake, and the community cake kind of keeps building up and building up and building up. Why? One of it is because in economics, you know, we want resource generation. So we want these programs. We want the youth to be employed. We want business. We not only want military industrial complexes, we want an industrial complex, and all of that stuff kind of starts from the bottom and builds up, not starts from the top and builds down. And so that's, again, I would say it's done. So with Professor Atta Sasamoa, and with the paradigm, the entity to build upon is the household. And so then the community of households, and the community of household kind of then from our democratic system, you know, they elect their legislative representatives, they elect their political representatives, and the political, the people are in a democracy, you know, the people are in power. And so it's not the you know, chief executive. The chief executive is that he's the chief executive of all the multiple polities. And so and with the cake, you know, absolutely, with the cake, resource generation, stimulate the economy, build the economy. What did President Clinton say, and other American presidents? It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. And so when you have a vibrant economy, that kind of solves a lot of problems. For example, it allows you to provide for a local law and order, so law enforcement. And so again, law enforcement is not in a state nation. Law enforcement starts from this top and builds down. It doesn't start with community policing or highway patrol or things like that. It doesn't include a national bureau of investigation or regional bureaus of investigation and so forth. And so those are the things, again, going back to, you know, the nation state rather than the state nation. And also, you know, these instruments of the power, the instruments of power are not limited or exclusive to the political. And so that's a big one, and that's a major one. But you have to, in order if you want it to be an instrument, the instrument can either be strong or weak. Right now, you know, one is stronger than the others, and that leaves an imbalance, and the imbalance is speaks for itself. As far as the circle back to the African perspectives on especially incorporating, make them known, put them down, and then allow others to kind of build upon them, and to be able and to respond to them, rather than having being in a receiver mode and accepting what you're offered.
All right, thank you very much. So basically, we find ourselves in the catch-22 situation, right? Because we are trying as much as possible to get an African perspective, right, as a way of moving away from the West or the donor organization, in terms of the US, in terms of Saudi Arabia, the Egyptians, but yet still, we are still getting donations from them. So because we are getting donations from them, we cannot have our own perspective, right? So let's move to the next narrative. If you look at the two countries, it seems that the South Sudan is on the path of a democratic transition, right? Even though they are having challenges over there, we'll get to that. But let's focus our attention on the Sudan, which is now being a quagmire of conflict. So I'm going to create a narrative in terms of a settlement, a peace agreement or settlement, right? Now, this is what Mr. Machi wrote. So in a quest to address the challenges and find a peaceful agreement to the Sudan conflict. He wrote in an article that was published on LinkedIn titled Better Alternative to Negotiated Settlements, how they play out in the Sudan, right? He made a number of assertions, and I want to just quote one of them. If there has been any conflict in recent years with so many failed peace efforts in Africa, it will be the South Sudan, it will be the Sudan conflict. The situation is so bad that experts find it easy to predict the outcomes of every new peace effort when it starts. They know it will fail, sadly. Now you continue to say that word. Despite the diplomatic weight of brokers like the United States and Saudi Arabia and the commitment to peace, nothing has changed. The more the parties talk, the worse it gets on the ground. My question to you, Mr. Machi, what makes the Sudan conflict so unique in Africa that experts are easy to predict the outcome of every new peace effort before it starts? Omit your microphone. Omit your microphone.
Sorry about that. I'm always putting it. Yeah. So firstly, it is about the entrenched position and the complex interest that characterizes this conflict. One is Dagalo. This is someone, as I mentioned earlier, who did not have any formal education, but through his connection with Bashir, he was able to rise to the very top of the Sudanese society and is currently called a general. In other African countries, people go through the mill to be called generals. People go through colleges and both internal and external. In Ghana, for instance, before you could become a general, you should be in Sandhurst in the UK, gotten some training elsewhere and all that. But Dagalo was able to stay within Sudan and become a general and command a force bigger than most generals across Africa will ever dream of. He is having hundreds of thousands of people under his command and has a lot of reservists across the Sahel who troop in to, join the army to get paid. Again, in the course of this, he has been able to amass wealth. He controls agricultural lands, cattle, and gold mines in Sudan. And so with these resources, nobody would like to give it up for peace in a situation that is created in Sudan. And furthermore, Dagalo also feels that at the initial stages of the war, he quickly thought it wise, in quote, to occupy sensitive infrastructure like hospitals, bridges, schools, and other museums museums in Sudan is a big deal because it's one of the cradles of civilization. It stretches all the way the Nile Valley. And so these sensitive areas he occupied with his RSF, knowing that he did not have the air power that the SAF had. And so the SAF were left with no option than to use aerial bombardment. This meant that the SAF became unpopular with time because hospitals were occupied by the RSF, and so it had to use air power to, disperse them, and in so doing, caught up with civilians, killed some civilians, and that made the SAF unpopular. And as I've said, African wars are not area wars; they are infantry wars because it's all about territory, how to capture more territory and get people and use humans as shields, and that is what the RSF was doing. So in every peace effort, one of the major demands by the SAF is for the RSF to withdraw from these areas, something Dagalo would never do. He would never, because immediately he withdraws from the city like Khartoum, Omdurman, and other major cities, then it means that could be the beginning of his end, because then the RSF, the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces will step in. And so this means that any peace effort becomes fruitless from the word go, because he is not likely to blink in respect of removing or concerning his withdrawal from such places. And this is how come in recent times he's been making a lot of gains in urban centers, because he moves. The Sudanese armed forces have used drones and all that, but then because of the human shields or the populated areas that the RSF operates, it becomes increasingly difficult for the SAF to make inroads. And currently, if you look at the tours that he is embarking on, and the fact that he's being hosted by African countries. At the beginning of the war, no country was willing to host him. But now he has that kind of comfort. He has that kind of leverage in Sudan that some countries in Africa want to host him. Like Rwanda, he was there a few days ago. He was in other Eastern African countries because now he has that kind of leverage to really negotiate. And as Doc said, when he was elevated to that level, his eyes on power was inevitable, and so now we see him, the Dagalo. Last time I saw Dagalo in suit, something that is quite rare. And when the military start wearing suit, it shows where they are heading towards.
All right, okay.
Burhan himself has started wearing suit. Yes. Yeah. So that's on a lighter note. So largely that is what is happening. And that is the main reason why experts like Mr. Todd and Dr. Atamensa will keep predicting that this is going to end nowhere, because it is almost something more radical must happen before this happens. Now, to wrap up, I spoke of the credibility or the weight of Saudi Arabia and the United States. The weight, in quote, is not because they are they cannot be ignored, but they have the finances. In recent times, Saudi Arabia has gathered a lot of reserves in terms of cash, and the US is the United States. And so then they have the money to actually influence how the dynamics could change. But even at that, Dagalo feels that there's more to gain within Sudan and what he has in Sudan than to, accept any offer by these great states or these great powers. And so whenever he goes to Jeddah, he goes there to talk, but he's not willing to change the dynamics on the ground to his disadvantage. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Let me come to you, Dr. Asamoah. When I read Mr. Marty's piece, I was a little bit fascinated. And based on his presentation, right, he has made the conflict, right, more or less like a chess game, right, where each of the two players, right, the SAF and RSF, know the moves. If this guy make this move, I know what kind of this move I'll make. That is international relations, that is expected, right? And in terms of diplomacy, in terms of trying to find a settlement, when you are negotiating in diplomacy, so when it involves superpowers, right? You know that, okay, when the Russians make this move, this is what the Americans are going to make. We know all these things. But in your e-symposium, right, Dr. Ibn Chambers brought in an argument in terms of the role that civil society organizations should play. And we saw the civil society organization, like the media house and scholars, the role they play in the Oslo Accord, right, in 1994. Why is the African Union not moving away, right, from these entrenched positions, right, and not focusing our attention on the civil society organization, as Dr. Ibn Chambers said, in terms of silencing the gap? Why are we still so bent on these entrenched positions, which is more or less like a chess game, right, and not moving away like what happened with the Oslo Accord? Why are we not trying that step?
Thank you very much. So, two things. I think your narrative about the chess game is very correct. And that is because the average Sudanese leader or politician, whether in the north or in the south, understands conflict far better than their compatriots anywhere in Africa. They've either been negotiating for a long time, and so they understand it. And conflicts in Sudan are not resolved that easily. They drag on. Look at the whole negotiation of the CPA. Mm-hmm. Look at what it took to contain the situation that started in South Sudan. And so it's complex. They understand it. They know when to split and splinter. Look at the Darfur situation, for instance, right? So you are dealing with a situation like that that has its own inherent complexes, but also actors who understand the dynamics sometimes much more than those who are facilitating the negotiations, right? And so it's a very complex situation, right? I remember in South Sudan, at some point, you had actors who at some point were even forum shopping, what many call forum shopping. At some point, they will try to bring in other actors, right? And the whole thing drags on and on. So the Sudan case, the reason why sometimes it's predictable is that it's complex. But part of the complexity around your main question, why the AU is not pushing this into the domain of the CSOs, is this. And I feel if this point I'm going to make, if we lose sight of it, we'll probably be doing ourselves a huge disservice.
Okay.
So what is happening is a distraction from, a diversion from the actual peace process in Sudan. Because if you remember, you had the military on one side and you had the civilian side, right? The civilian side has had its own complexities. All of these within the transitional agreement, which had its challenges. We have seen coups, but there was a process to try and revive it. Then you have the civilians division, they've kept it within the boardroom of, the usual politics, actual politics. Then you have the military side, Hamati and Burhan, who were key components, key leaders on the military side within the Sovereignty Council. They start fighting, and are we supposed to suddenly collapse the process, or we should keep the process, finish off with them, and come back to the transitional process? I feel that is what we've got to do. And the reason why it's become difficult now to activate the the civil society component is that this is a banter between two army generals who were on one side and kicking really hard, kicking the tummies of the civilian side. And suddenly they are fighting. I don't think we should suddenly make what they are doing the mainstream negotiation platform. From where I sit, they should finish their fighting and then come to the boardroom and we start talking. That is when we can actually begin the process. Because if we go with what they are doing, then we would have thrown away the entire civilian component. Because at what point do you insert the civilian conversation into what is essentially a military discussion, right? And so if we allow what is happening, the gender process and all of this, to become the mainstream negotiation, we would have lost the plot, and we would have played into the chess game of these military manipulators, because we would then be struggling to find a space for the civilian component. But the actual thing is the transitional agreement is the mainstream. Finish your fighting and come back to the table. Whatever becomes of you, whoever stays out of your banter and mouse and cat game, come to the negotiation table and face the civilian component. Part of it is, and this is where my frustration happens, the civilian front should, first of all, make sure that the world does not forget the fact that this is a diversion. And so we need to come back to the negotiation table. Second is that they need to fix their own internal divisions, because they are too split along the political lines that it's almost difficult to know who are the key animators of the civilian front at this particular point. I mean, as Todd said, the family system could be an anchor point. But when you have all of these also saddled in politics and religious divisions and all of that, it becomes difficult to find an anchor point. But at least we have civil society actors that could be the anchor point. So we have a certain frame. Regardless of their divisions, the fight going on now should be their basis for mobilizing. If at all, one thing we learned from South Sudan is that one thing about Sudanese, when they have a common enemy, they stay together. And so I expect the civilian side to stay together and remain resolute so their voices do not melt into the confusion that is happening. Because for now, the international attention is really about how do we stop these guys from bringing Khartoum into rebels, and how then do we fix it? But we shouldn't forget that after you've done that, you have to come back to the room where the civilian component is seated waiting before we start talking. Either than that, we will miss the plot. But it's become difficult now to insert a civilian dimension into this conversation and to activate the civil society side, because it's become much more an entrenched open war confrontation. And the focus initially on the AU side, African member states, was about how do we get our citizens out of this mess, first of all. Remember that Burhan said he could not even guarantee safe passage for the African leaders who were supposed to go in and have a conversation with him. So that is where it's become difficult. But I agree. In theory, we need to open the door for civil society. And they've done incredibly good work. The Sudanese women, Sudanese civil society, the area defense forces, they have kept the country running. They have made sure that in Khartoum, they can keep people warned. They safe corridors for people to evacuate. They've done incredibly good work. But at the political level, that is the challenge on the ground.
Thank you very much with this explanation, right? Now, the reason why I'm saying that, I'm going to go to Lieutenant Kwaka, right? Actually, we were supposed to have a representative. We sent an invitation to a representative from the National Endowment for Democracy for them to come over here. Now, what you just said now, right? When we sent we sent it about 2-3 weeks ago, right? And just probably like this week, they came out with they are too busy, they cannot be there. Now, I had a conversation actually with Takoka this morning. What you just said is now making me have a better understanding of why they do not want to be on the program, in the sense that they see that, okay, there is a military conflict going on, right? So let the military people deal with their issues. And when they finish dealing with their issues, then we at the National Endowment for Democracy would start engaging with the civilians. Because at this point, there's no need for us to be engaging with the civilians, because if we engage them, it's not going to go to anywhere unless the military aspect of it has been resolved. Lieutenant Akoka, do you share with my assertion based on the analysis that Dr. Asamoah just did? Do you agree with that? That even if you are trying to engage with civil society organization in this conflict, it's not going to go anywhere because the military aspect has not been resolved.
Well, I think I think that you do more than one thing can happen at simultaneously and concurrently. Clearly, it would be the best to resolve of the military aspect of it, and so and that will we will see how that goes. We will and with Dr. Owusu talked about the position being entrenched on both sides, and that reflects what you're talking about as this unresolved military conflict. I would offer that the civil society and in my vernacular, the general public doesn't have to wait for that to settle. And while they are trying to resolve the military, I do believe that there again, and this goes back to Ibn Chambers get the general public involved. It is their foundation, and it is the civilian front. The general public is in fact the anchor. The military is not the anchor of the country. Any country, the general public includes families, tribes, individuals, communities. That's the general public. Even though some countries may have hundreds of thousands of people in uniform, they still have hundreds of thousands of people not in uniform. We talk about democracy, and what's one of the main tenets of democracy? Civilian control of the military. And so, if the civilian is not in control of the military, then you have violated one of the core democratic principles. I would say again, and I still and now with the National Endowment for Democracy and others, and I think that it's partly because of the absence of democratic programs over a number of decades, that has the end result being a decline in democracy in many countries. We see, I don't know if it's the Africa barometer, we're talking about general impressions of how democracy is evolving in the West and West as in West Africa and elsewhere. Democracy has been on a decline. And so the public's impressions of democracy is that, well, it may have been okay, decades ago. It's increasingly becoming less and less relevant. And so and also with that, and we're talking about with external interventions. And if you have if particularly with a superpower offering support to countries, one of the things that you would have expected from the U.S. would be to have a major democratic instruments, democratic programs, democratic interventions throughout the region. But as you will see in many U.S. missions abroad, they are not the missions do not have a major effort in democracy. They have a major effort in military assistance, and they have major efforts in diplomacy, but less so for democracy. And so we were talking before about asking for the right thing and getting the right thing, and not, and just kind of be careful about kind of what offices and countries are willing to offer rather than what you need. And so the circle back on the national endowment, the military, it would in Sudan, both in the north and in the south, particularly first in the north with the two generals kind of misbehaving. The question is, okay, how do you address that? How do you get the generals to not misbehave? And so we kind of have to lay out what the options are to act as a deterrent. I don't know that anybody has hit on the thing that's going to work. What African militaries recognize over the past quarter century is the PKOs, peacekeeping operations, peace support operations, kind of to insert and interject between physical forces and physical powers, have not been very effective. We have talked before about, or I have talked before about, what do we want African militaries to do? Do we want African militaries to be to use the U.S. language, war fighters, or we do want African militaries to be peacekeepers? Africa has to make some very tough decisions because these types of things, if you don't have a strong professional military, then you have militaries and who are led by folks who much like the Wagner Group. The head of the Wagner Group kind of elevates up to the ranks without the requisite education. It's clearly not without the military training, but with the background of a criminal, and he took the lead and he took the realm, and he was at the head of them, but he got too big for his britches. And then he kind of went from Ukraine up into Russia, and he paid the ultimate price for it. But that's what happens if you don't have professional organizations. So with it, and with the political power, the political power has to know, what the other elements of power are, and there have to be checks and balances. So that folks like Bashir don't kind of figure out how to manipulate the system. The system should not be manipulated, but should have its own checks and balances to keep out of control folks from manipulating it, and in the process manipulating Africans.
All right, thank you very much. Right, time is fast spent, right? So I'd like us to, Tarkoka just brought in the issue about the Wagner Group, which is more or less another variable. So I want us to take a look at that narrative, right? Then we'll discuss it. We have probably like a few minutes, right? So let me come back to Dr. Asamoah, right? 4 months ago, right, speakers at the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, I'm talking about, we just talked about civil society groups right now, in an symposium titled Foreign Fighters and Mercenaries, Implications for Silencing the Guns in Africa. They highlighted a number of reasons to silence the gun in Africa by 2030. Among some of the speakers, like I've iterated before, Ambassador Ibn Chambers, African Union High Representative for Silencing the Gun, emphasized the importance of civil society organizations' role in the journey to silencing the gun 2030. Then we have Mr. William Carey, head of ECOSAC, also highlighting the significance of foreign fighter mercenaries in Africa and implications for peace. Now, additionally, yourself, Dr. Asamoah, you and Mr. Rasool Jean-Michel. Mr. Michel is the DCF, the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, who were part of the panelists, right? In your presentation, you explained the uncontrolled proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and the use of foreign fighters and mercenaries to sustain conflict, right? Which tends to exacerbate violence, fuel crime, and terrorism, right? So you made this assertion, right? So my question to you, does your assertion on the use of foreign fighters and mercenaries vindicate those who claim that the Wagner Group's footprint on the African continent and also in supplying weapons to the Sudan warring factions have been a major driver of sustaining the conflict, even though the conflict in the Sudan has been going on forever before the Wagner Group made its footprints on the African continent in 2006?
That's an interesting one. So first of all, Wagner's footprint is increasing, right? Not only in covert situations, but clearly in terms of established and very open relationship with states. You've seen them in Mali, you've seen their footprints almost all over the place in some countries. As to whether it's been of benefit to the continent, I think the jury is still out there. Again, some of us have been concerned about situations where certain actors are being asked to leave in the name of neocolonialism, but certain flags are also being raised almost concurrently. That raises questions about the logic of the whole thing. Because if you want one out, you should almost keep everyone out. It's the best way to play the big power game, not one in place of the other. However, I also have read reports about Wagner having been cited during the Bashir-led protest, I mean the Bashir-related protests in the early days, there were pictures of vans that were attributed to have been their footprints. But I would be a little hesitant to entirely blame the escalation of the conflict in recent times to their footprints, because that will actually be minimizing the robust capacity of some of the actors, right? Particularly the RSF. If you look at their footprints and the kind of fighters that were sent to to Yemen to fight, they've had capacity. They've had the money. If you look at their footprints in the gold mining sector and the links with exportation of certain minerals for their source of funds, and the likes of the Sudanese army, right? That will be actually minimizing their significance. If at all, I'm yet to see any report that explicitly points to clear evidence of them having supplied weapons. I haven't checked the last couple of UN panel of experts reports, because they usually do that much granular mapping of things like that. But the broader ambit of the danger associated with a group like that, I think is being appreciated very much. And that is why the symposium was, the timing was apt, because we were drawing attention again to the OAU Convention against mercenarism in Africa, which was, which was adopted in the 70s. But there's an ongoing process to revive and to update it in appreciation of the kind of complexities happening. Part of the fallout across Africa of Wagner's presence links to all these push for peace support operations to exit. We've seen that in Mali, and we are also seeing that in DRC and to some extent in Somalia. All of these do not bode well for the continent, because I can tell you on authority that we are not yet ready to completely step into the situations in those cases. And those countries do not necessarily have the capacity to sustain the gains made. And that is why in some of the cases, when these peacekeeping operations exit, we almost see a concurrent rise in insecurity. Why? Because the actors, the violent extremist groups, are not going to wait for a new force to come in, right? And I think, per the logic, it is better because peacekeeping is also a numbers game, right? So if you ask the UN to exit, whatever it is, if the UN was keeping even just one town safe, that was still a gain. So when you ask them to exit, you're actually creating a vacuum to begin with. And so it's a retrogression in the first place before you start to work off of a negative variable instead of even zero at all. So these are some of the complexities of the Wagner. I think the actual footprint and its impact in specific case of Sudan is yet to be completely mapped out. And I always avoid the danger of getting sucked into a Western narrative and imperial power play when we don't have all the facts on the table. And I think on that particular case, we need to be cautious about where we put our cards.
All right, thank you very much. Right. Okay, let me go to Mr. Machi. Right now, Tad Coker was talking about the individual to the community, right? Before it's bottom up, right? In the United States, it's bottom up, but most times in Africa, it's top down. Now, most of Africa historically, right, it has always been about regime protection. African government has always been about regime protection. And the Wagner Group, right, present a good case, right, for regime protection. Because most of these governments are going to the Wagner as a way of trying to maintain peace, right, or security for them to be able to hold on to grip to power. So the Wagner Group tastes like it's a good thing. So for some of those African countries who are not very, very democratic, who want to preserve their longevity in power, they see the Wagner Group as very, very attractive as a way of holding on to power, because they are not so much concerned about the bottom. They are always concerned at the top. Would you agree with that? That is why the countries like Sudan, the military will be willing to have the Wagner Group have its footprint in the country. Will you agree to that?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, because I have written extensively on Wagner, and I granted about 24 interviews to international media on Wagner. The issue here is that in many cases, just like Doc said, you are talking about removing one imperialist, but then you find some solace in Wagner that does not even understand the fabrics of African society. And I'll give you an example, is in Mali. In Mali, what Wagner does is it supports the Malian military against extremism on paper. But what it does is they go to central Mali and shoot people at random just to put fear in the people. And in so doing, they target specific ethnicities like the Fulbe or the Fulani, that, well, since we find a lot of Fulani joining extremists, any Fulani we meet is perhaps an extremist or a terrorist. So they get to your community and shoot people at random. In fact, the main reason UN was booted out of Mali is because of the reports it brought about Wagner. And just after the report, Mali found problems with the UN mission in its territory. In fact, the UN did not achieve all what it was meant to achieve in Mali. That is granted. However, the situation after the UN forces left is worse than it was before. So Wagner is there. And the interesting thing is that when Wagner is signing deals, it signs deals to take gold resources. They are not interested in cash. They want resources. And Mali is one of the major producers of gold. Sudan is another. And in Sudan, Dagalo was working with Wagner. And the main reason Khalifa Haftar of Eastern Libya is an ally to Dagalo of the RSF is because of Wagner. They have Wagner in common. And it makes with the Western, Eastern Sudan, Libya and Western Sudan a corridor that Wagner moves freely. This is what is happening. And what is the genesis of Wagner? If you want to know the genesis of Wagner, we all know the infamous Prigozhin fracas that went on in Russia. This is someone Putin was not able to control. The founder of Wagner was someone Putin was not able to control. So you can just imagine the kind of things they were doing when he was there. And currently, the news is that, just like Niccolo Machiavelli said, that people don't forget the killing of, people may forget the killing of their fathers and mothers, but they will not forget the taking away of their properties. Russia is doing everything to hand over Wagner to the son of Prigozhin in order to create the semblance of some succession, in order to keep holding on to its possessions in Africa. Because at a point, Wagner was actually became a pseudo foreign policy tool for Russia, Moscow. So in Central African Republic, in Sudan, and even Sierra Leone, because they were using Sierra Leonean logistics to ship in and out their goods and produce. They were in beer making and timber, business, all kinds of things. So my problem is not the presence of Russia in Africa. I think that Africans have a choice to relate to whoever they want to. But when you are bringing in a private military company that is geared towards profits, and the African situation is so sensitive, and our situations are so complex, you will not find solution with such a group. And so in and across Africa, the Wagner dimension to the conflict, and even in Sudan, is not so palatable. But let's move a little bit. The time is past spent, but let's move a little bit to the Red Sea basin, the Red Sea. in all this discussion, we have ignored, I think Mr. Mashar brought it up, but then it was a little short. Now, the Red Sea has become another point of contest between Russia and the West. The Port Sudan is really wanted by Russia to build a naval base. It will be the first of its kind, apart from what it has in Syria. Now, from what we are seeing by Houthi rebels who are now firing on shipping on ships that are using the Suez Canal and the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, connecting the Indian Ocean, what it means is that if Russia gets to stay in the Red Sea, people, and we can all expect what is likely to happen, that in any configuration, Russia can maintain a chokehold in that vital shipping route or trade route.
Let me interject over there. That is more or less geopolitics, which is understandable, right? But when we go to what Dr. Asamoah just said, is that we've not had any factual basis at this point, right? We know actually. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, actually, Russia's interest in Sudan is not a secret. It is in the literature. It's everywhere.
What we are saying here is that we know there are footprints, but their footprints are not so extensive enough to contribute to what is actually happening, to be like a causal factor.
In terms of Wagner or Russia?
Factor. In terms of Wagner, right? In terms of
Wagner, yes, but the issue is this. The presence of Wagner actually revamped strengthened the position of Dagalo because he dealt with them. It's something that is well known. And the issue, Wagner was actually brought into Sudan by Bashir. Bashir went to Moscow and brought Wagner. It's something that is so clear. And it was supposed to protect mines, some mines in Sudan. So when they came in, and you see, there is this narrative about Wagner that often confuses a lot of the discussion, in that sometimes when they come in, they recruit locals. So the idea is that, well, if I come to Mali and I'm not finding a white-skinned person, then it means that perhaps there's no Wagner, or we are exaggerating the role of Wagner. But it's so clear that they recruit Africans. And some time ago, I wrote an article that, look, at a point, all these African recruits to Wagner may become a burden on the state because they will receive sophisticated training. And when Wagner has left, these guys could become a threat to the respective states they were recruited from. So these are very...
Yeah, let me go to Lieutenant Akoka, right? But going back to what Dr. Asamoah said, right? The Wagner may have some influence, but he's making the argument that the SAF and the RSF are very sophisticated armies, right? So they are more in charge of what is actually happening. Now let me move to another question. Lieutenant Akoka, will you agree with Dr. Asamoah and Dr. Michel, right, assertion that the proliferation of small weapons and light weapons in South Sudan, we all saw South Sudan, right, in terms of the SPLM, right, and the army, the way they were able to fight the North. So you have young people being recruited at a very young age, having access to weapons and all this stuff, and the war is over. But still, these small weapons are in the hands of individuals, right? So will you agree to the assertion being made that the proliferation of weapons and light weapons in South Sudan, resulting from its war with the North, has contributed to the challenges of engaging in a proper and meaningful security sector reforms? Would you agree to that? Because the weapons are in the hands of individuals scattered all over the place. And how do you engage in a meaningful security sector reform if you have these weapons proliferated all over the country? Would you agree to that?
Well, so the small arms and light weapons, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons is long enduring. So it has been around for a while, and so it is so that's a fact. It is and because having a weapon obviously presents a threat, and so it presents a potentially a mortal threat to anyone who the weapon is used against. I think that I think the proliferation of small arms and white left weapons, much like these armies, these rogue armies, have been around for decades. Those are threats that need to be registered and addressed. And so the question is how. When I was in the go, relating back to Cote d'Ivoire from 99 until 2010, 2011, actually for about a decade there. There was the proliferation and of small arms too. There were reputed mercenaries coming out of Liberia across the border, Cote d'Ivoire's western border across, and so there was the phenomenon of small arms, light weapons. I know about this small arms and light weapons, all throughout the ECOWAS, but going back to Liberia and Sierra Leone, and then also as we kind of go up to some of the other regions. But you want to talk specifically about Sudan and South Sudan. I think it has to be. And so, but a question is, okay, how is it dressed in society, and how is it dressed in civil society? How is it dressed in how does the general public address it? What laws are on the books, if any, and then how are the laws enforced? I don't know. There is, and then how do we know? How do they go and try to locate the small arms and light weapons, and then to handle it? Going back to what we were talking about in Cote d'Ivoire, part of what, in addition to in the security sector reform, they also had the DDR, disarmament, dismobilization, and reintegration. And so that is always, kind of on in the list of the options in terms of how to approach it. And the folks at the Kofi Annan Center talk about it, and they have these courses on DDR. But that's both with the known combatants in terms of these two forces, the SAF and the RSF, but also to the other people in the community. I don't know if there are militias, or I know there are militias because they were saying that the SAS and Bashir funded some in South Sudan. So those are militias. We were dealing with the militias in Cote d'Ivoire as well, and looking for the accountability of the small arms and light weapons, and trying to get a hold of them. I don't know. I think both of the countries really do have a long road ahead, trying to make some corrective actions and to move into the direction of going beyond this and silencing the guns. And with what you're talking about, with not only the two armies in constant combat, and with the militias in South Sudan, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, it just kind of makes an even stronger case that it will just take time to finally settle and resolve. That said, it happens. There is resolution. And so, and it gets to the issue of dialogue and talking and working it out. And that's the case in point in Cote d'Ivoire, is that there was strong opposition, in the North-South divide. There was, and there were strong emotions involved in there too, and some really horrific incidences with some of the key actors there. I think but my example from Cote d'Ivoire is that, after it did take, and I don't know if I'm biased or not, but it did take someone of Wataris caliber, if you will, with his background, with the I don't know if it was the World Bank or I think or the IMF, and knowing economically how to move forward is what many of these situations are going to take. The question is, do you have someone who is uneducated, like Prigozhin and some of the others, and then stalled into power, or do you have somebody who actually brings something to the table for progress? In Cote d'Ivoire, we were talking about it as when President Ouattara kind of took office. He as with our security sector reform, he and as I observed him working with the others, the French ambassador, the SRSG of UNOSI, the U.S. ambassador, and others, and he made a commitment when he was after his inauguration. He made public international commitments, SSR, DDR, and economic reform, and other issues. And he was pressed by the superpowers to hold good on those commitments. And so, how did he do that? I think his second presidential decree was what? The establishment of the SSR steering committee. And so that's kind of was clear to me that he was quite serious about it. And in the process of establishing that committee, he turned to the French ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, and others, and said, "Here is my strength is in economics. U.S. I know your strength is in security, and I also and we not so much trust you more, but you are more of a neutral player than the French, and so we're hoping that you can kind of help us to steady the security ship here in the country." And so those are some of the approaches. What did we do what do we do in Cote d'Ivoire? The U.S. specifically, we said we are not going to reinforce the armed forces of Senegal. We are not going to reinforce the new FRCI or the Force Nouvelle. And so the U.S. conscientiously did not work with the military, but it did conscientiously work with the police. Why? Because we were emphasizing civilian law enforcement. And so that was, I think that kind of has paid dividends over time, that we have that. And so we started with a pilot program in Cote d'Ivoire, community policing, where way out west we were because the U.S. had an objective that was different than the Ivorian objective. The U.S. objective was to reestablish security in high-risk areas. So we did so in Tulapla and Dokwe out to the west. The Minister of Interior in Cote d'Ivoire thought we were crazy. Why? Because his focus, as many on the continent, their focus is on the capital. So their focus is on the main city. Here, it would be Khartoum and elsewhere. And the minister said, my number one priority is Abidjan. My number two priority is Yamoussoukro. And he said, Americans, why are you going out onto our west coast with Liberia? That's so far removed that's out of my sight picture. And our response was, you need to make sure, our responsibility is to make sure the entire country is secure. And so those are the types of discussions that kind of need to be thrown into the mix. Again, I will keep on beating the drum about civil society and the public and law enforcement and civilian control of the military in a democratic setting. So a long way to answer your questions is about small arms and light weapons. They are going to in South Sudan. They are going to be there. Register that as a known threat, and then to develop a course of action, if you will, to address them. And you don't have to address the threats one by one or one at a time or in a particular priority. It is what you're able to do, the resources available, and the time allotted to do it. Again, so it's kind of working up a strategy, working up a strategy with courses of action, with concepts of support to each of the courses of action and moving forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that analysis. Now let me come to you, Dr. Samoa. Right, we've seen what happened in Sierra Leone. We saw what happened in Sierra Leone. We saw what happened in Liberia, right? In terms of small arms, right? Now, what lessons could be learned from that? In the case of South Sudan, we know African countries, mostly society is a little bit stronger than the state, right? Now you have a society, weapons spread over the place, and mostly, if you look, they are based on clans and ethnicity compared to what we have in Sierra Leone and what we have in Liberia. What we have in South Sudan is about regionalism, tribalism, ethnicism, right? And these arms are there. How do you embark on an effective security sector reform based on all these divisions, right? How do you do that? Taking into consideration the lesson that we could learn from Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone, they were not so much complicated as to what is happening in South Sudan. Would you agree to that? And how do you go about doing security sector reform over there in South Sudan?
I think to add to the complexity, you need to bring in the dimension that the army, right? It's not the army, the traditional kind of army, and so it's an amalgamation, or if you like, particular people and their loyalists from different ethnic groups in a mix. And so even in the army, that is how come you have several hundreds of generals in an army that is young and that fought so much, that has experience in the bush. I think the way forward in terms of solution, first of all, I mean, many people are hesitant to admit the fact that the UN arms embargo is necessary.
Okay.
There are many people who say all sorts of things, but I worked as a member of the UN panel of experts, and we know the extent to which arms are extensive in that country, right? And so I think it's just logic that if you really want to find a way to deal with it, you stop more arms from coming into the situation, first of all. And so, but it's a call on the region. I know there's always political sensitivity around these things and whether other countries should support it. If the state needs it, they can always ask for a certain exemptions, to equip the army. But there has to be assurance that there's not going to be leakages from state-owned stockpiles that will end up in the wrong hands, because that is a massive thing. There's so much arms in the country. And arms possession has almost also infiltrated into cultural significance. And so sometimes, young people having arms and all of that. So how do you also, from a community perspective, do extensive education so that there's a certain distancing and rollback of the role of certain arms in the cultural celebrations and all of that? Then how do we stop ammunition from going in? Because if you have an AK-47 and you don't have ammunition, it's essentially a decoration too, right? And that is where securing the involvement of regional actors, I can mention names, but I don't want to do that. It's important because some of them play a key role in transshipment of arms into the situations like that. There are situations where used arms have actually been transferred into South Sudan, and those have not And those have played key roles in changing the conflict dynamics. That's why I indicated that sometimes you need to look at the regional players and what they are doing on top of, as much as we are always eager to finger point the West. Yeah, the West are not angels, but we also have certain regional actors who play a role. So that is important. Then we need to then do extensive. I think at some point the Japanese government was involved in a huge disarmament program across West Africa. Something like that is necessary in South Sudan. And then we need a proper kind of security sector reform of the army. What is part of the transition process really needs to happen. Proper training, proper disarmament programs, proper reassigning of those that will not make it into the army itself, repurposing of their orientation away from the gun into proper jobs. So it's a whole reintegration. It's not just an army question. It's also about how do you put young people into proper use, reoriented, retrained, and retooled and repurposed in a way that helps the country. I feel that going forward, that is necessary. How do you even modernize the South Sudanese army itself so that the core of the army also has what it takes to project a strong control over the use of violence so that no one wants to take all of this into themselves? So these are things that need to happen. But first of all, massive education of the country. But how do you do that if people cannot feel secure? Because existence is, feeling safe is existential. And so to the extent that they don't feel the safety in the streets, they want to own guns. One of the things about South Sudan is that you cannot do all of this disarmament in an uneven way. Because below the national level conflict you and I know are deep-seated inter-ethnic rivalries.
Right.
Around cattle rustling, around child kidnapping, around all sorts of things, to the extent that sometimes it takes arms in a community to create the kinds of arms balance that brings about a certain sense of stability. And so if you are going to remove it, has to be extensive and at the same time. Else you create a mixed match, which will be very catastrophic. This is in some of the communities, cattle rustling is a huge thing. And so beyond the conflict between Riek Machar and President Kiir and all those actors, you have community level, organized cattle rustling, which is massive, which is armed, and which is very dangerous. And these are all around arms. So their case is complex. Researchers will always insert ourselves into the situation. We need a very extensive mapping of the situation and how to unravel it in a way that creates stability, both in the minds of the people and really on the ground before we can unwrap this complexity in South Sudan.
Yeah, thank you very much. You said something very, very interesting that I would like to Mr. Amachi to have a last word. We'll go to that closing remark. You talk about researchers, right? Right. I think that is something that we've not been able to do, to be able to be out over to tell the actual story, right? Because most of the narratives is mostly coming from the West. And sometimes when narratives are coming from the West, most Africans are very, very skeptical in terms of, oh yeah, it is all about their interest. So researchers should do a better job. We saw, like you said, you saw what happened in Sierra Leone, the example that you gave in West Africa in terms of disarmament and reintegrating those young people who are following Charles Taylor into the army, right? So maybe this time, right, we should be able to speak up to get the regional actors involved in some of these things. Okay, Mr. Amachi, what would you have to say to that?
But if I can come on that before maybe Amachi comes in.
Yeah, go ahead.
You see, the lack of African narratives in mainstream is not necessarily an indication of lack of an African narrative.
Okay.
Right? But the global north only hears itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have gatekeepers of these narratives and who have made it their role to continue to it's an echo chamber of side themselves and all of that. And so part of the struggle is how does the West get to a point where they feel there's a narrative missing they need to hear? To what extent in your university will your colleagues be so comfortable if a lot of your sources are African sources and not Western sources? So there's a broader conversation in the epistemic community, the academic community, which also needs its own decolonization and discussion. Because there are a lot of this African narrative. I work in Africa, I do research in Africa, and I know what I'm talking about. And until all of these gatekeepers and gatekeeping systems are create rooms for the African narrative to come in, it will continue to be one-sided. But that will not mean that the African researchers are not doing the work or are not creating narratives. It's about access here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like what you said, like earlier on, I told you that I had to read a lot of pieces or dialogue of the ISS on LinkedIn. It never used to be that, but now it's like on LinkedIn almost all the time. So you're able to read to see the African perspective, which was normally not there before. So there's an African perspective, but it is not echoed out over there. Maybe the Western perspective has actually taken root of that. All right, let's go to Mr. Machi. What would be your take on that? Should we go back and revisit what we did in West Africa in terms of the Japanese disarmament and reintegrating those rebels into the army? We should do the same thing, look at the regional actors in Africa, or the AU play a key role, right? Taking into consideration these community conflicts. Is that a way to go in terms of educating the people? What will be your take on trying to resolve the proliferation of these small arms and its effect, right, on engaging in proper security sector reform?
Yeah, your question is quite loaded. However, I would also take it from the African perspective argument. What I have evolved myself because some time ago I used to feel that there's nothing about Africa. We are always overshadowed and all that kind of narrative, especially when I was a university student. However, over time I've come to realize that there is so much African narrative, so much, just that we are not looking at them like Doc is saying. The thing is, we find a lot of our scholars schooling in the West. And so mostly that has some influence. However, they write, and when they write, I look at information more realistically than where it is coming from or who is writing it. For instance, I've found Caucasians who write, if that's the right word to use, but who write analysis on Africa, and I look at the substance. If what they are saying is the fact, I don't care who is writing it. If a Russian decides to write about Africa, and I think that it's not propaganda, and it is the fact, I don't really mind who the color of the person or in his educational orientation, because I've found non-African nationals who have written more detailed and have a very good understanding. For instance, Professor Buzan, who used to be with the LSE, I think he's still there, about his regional security theory. Yeah, and it's very impressive. I don't need him to be an African for me to know that what he was writing makes sense. And I've used the theory and it works. Where he had a problem, he mentioned that look, he has not paid attention to the sub-state actors in Africa because he has not done enough research on that. And reading the work, I really appreciated it. So I take a more realistic view when it comes to this perspective. Now back to the arms proliferation. Now, I think about 2 days ago, I reshared a post I made some 8 months ago on proliferation of weapons and illicit traffic of arms and all those, and the route they take. Recently, when Ethiopia had issues with Somalia, I was concerned because Now, the Ethiopian corridor is what is a major entry point for such arms, looking at if you consider the sources. And the more destabilized, did I say Ethiopia? Somalia, sorry. The more destabilized Somalia becomes, the more porous the entry points become, and then the flow of such weapons. So from Somalia, it gets concentrated in the Chad Basin, and it spreads across the region. Putting what happened in the 2011 and 2012 aside, where Gaddafi's armories became proliferated, the main route uses Somalia and other places, other points, other ports, porous ports. For instance, with the West African coast, we found places like Guinea-Bissau and other weaker countries having very compromised ports where arms can go through. So that is very important. Now, on disarming, before, if I'm holding arms to protect my interests, before you take that gun from me, you should guarantee my interest. That is where we are. Because then what made me get a gun? Because of something that you were not able to provide for me as maybe the state, as a regional power. So if you are Kenya and I'm in DRC, Eastern DRC, and you are coming in to disarm me, I will ask you that, well, you may have some stability in Kenya. I don't have it here. So are you going to provide me that stability, that security, in order to take away my AK-47 from me? That is the question I'll ask. So until you provide that, whatever you be telling me will fall on deaf ears, because I will not give in my gun. It's very rational that way.
Okay, hold on. I think time is fast spent. I would like you to use that for your closing remarks. Okay, time is fast spent. So, Dr. Asamoah, let me come back to you in terms of your closing remarks, right? So what we are saying is silencing the guns, right? The tragedy of the two Sudan. We all agree that what happened in 2011 and what we are currently seeing now is a tragedy. What will be your closing remarks in terms of silencing the guns and the tragedy of the two Sudans going forward? How do we resolve some of this conflict going forward?
I feel the story of the Sudans reflect the inherent complexities in African cases, from the nature of the state to the complexity of the society, the state-society relations, the external involvement, and a whole range of actors. So there's a lot we can learn from how we have managed and to some extent also mismanaged the Sudan experience. For me, the lesson is not so much in what we've lost, it's so much how we take the right lessons and move forward with that. To every people, there's always a never again story. And so the way forward always depends on how you create the narrative of unity and togetherness from when you look back and say, never again do we want to go there. A lot is being done at the continental level. Some of those initiatives could be better. But one good thing Africa has done is that at the continental and regional levels, we've been able to put together the key building blocks that together create the network of frameworks and possible action points that can guide the way forward. The way forward, however, cannot remain narratives. It has to be action.
Actions, right.
And the talking has been so much. And so I think at all levels, it has to be action. Action, leadership, sustained action, refined leadership. It's the only way Africa can achieve what we need to do. But I think we have spent so much time blaming others for our problems. We need introspection. We need to own our destinies. We need to start blaming ourselves for what we haven't done. And by so doing, plan how we can be better going forward. That's the only way Africa can own our destiny.
All right, thank you very much. So you are excused. You can leave us while we get a closing remark. All right, let's go to
Thank you very much.
Lieutenant Tadkoka. All right, yeah, let's get your closing remark. Then Mr. Machi will have the final word. So, what do you think should be the way forward, given all these complexities, right? What should you think should be some of the things that we should take into consideration, not about narratives anymore, but like Asamoah said, it should be about action, sustained action and leadership and the political will to solve some of these conflicts. Yeah.
I think with this, thank you for this, and thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the exchange of observations and opinions and so forth. I would offer. So I would say, you know, lay out the situation as is. Lay it down. Here is where we are. This is what the situation is. This is the as is. And on one side, on the other, on the far end, then you would say, okay, this is the to be. This is what we want. And then how do we move from the as is to the to be? A couple of parts on this. And so again, it's the paradigm. You know, this is the current paradigm. What is the potential future paradigm? And so what the part of some people say, okay, what's the vision? What's the compelling vision of a foreseeable future? What are you trying to get now? And with that, so I don't know if it applies. Is it a state nation trying to get to a nation state? What are those two terms mean? When it talks about, well, we know the overbearance, if you will, of the military, and so that's the as is. The to be is what people might reflect as professional militarism. The to be might be, okay, the professional military in a democratic society. Professional military in democratic might mean civilian control. What does civilian control mean? How do we mobilize civilians? And so, you know, you see the military and so forth, but you don't the civilians are not prominent. Why not? That doesn't make any sense in a society that the civilians are suppressed. Couple of things of why they may be suppressed or why they be. What is the what is law? What is rule of law? What laws are there? What laws are not there? We talk specifically when we talk about small arms and light weapons. There was no mention, zero mention of what is the mechanism for law enforcement. You know, a brother Owusu was talking about, okay, well, if you're going to take my weapon away from me, then you have to, we need to talk about this because you're not going to leave me exposed like this. And so what is, we haven't talked about what is the, you know, civilian law enforcement. Why is civilian law enforcement kind of not a growth industry? Why are these communities not protected by their policing forces? What do the policing forces look like or consist of? And so that's where you have it. Talking about taking of people in uniform and converting them to police or civilian policing or civilian law enforcement duties is reasonable. Also, it's reasonable to have an own separate or a different policing project, because policing is not military. Yeah. They are not, you know, they are completely separate and distinct. So to assume and falsely that it's easy for a person in uniform for in rank and file and order and discipline and regimentation is the right person to do community policing might not be the optimal solution. So my own observation is that's partly because the military works in small units. It doesn't work individual. It doesn't work with the civilian, and it doesn't work with community. So you have to be careful about transitioning military folks into community. So those are some of the aspects of it. What we have again, if you for the 2B, you have to say, okay, what do we need to address? And so what a couple of suggestions that I've had in the past is that what has worked, particularly for the military, is that our policies are not necessarily the perfect policies, but it's a different policy. And the different policy in the U.S., particularly for the U.S. Marine Corps, is that the Marines are prohibited. Marines are strictly prohibited from wearing uniform in public. And that part of the reason is that because you don't want to, if a Marine wore his uniform in public, he would intimidate the public. And so, but that's not his job. His job is to accomplish missions and take care of the troops. And so and then again, if you remove the uniform from the military in Africa, the military would go berserk.
Yeah.
And so that's really what you want to do. You want to say, okay, no. And again, this is the check and balance. This is how civilian is control of the military. And the other thing is that in the U.S. military, at every rank and maybe every other year, what do we have to do? We have to take an oath of office, and the oath of office says, "What? I pledge allegiance to the Constitution and to the others, not to these strong arms and rulers." And so the question is, okay, what do you want? What's the future? And so those are just kind of some teases in terms of how to turn a ship. But with the small arms and light weapons, that's that's a law enforcement issue in the communities. And how do the communities address it? And if you start at the household and you build up to the community, and then the community says, okay, this is our local police. And so if anything, you might want to convert the militias to certified law enforcement officials. So it's a mentality and to overcome. But absolutely, every community needs to be secure. Every community, if cattling rustling if there is a law against cattle rustling, then you need to kind of hold the cattle rustlers accountable and place them under arrest or put them in incarceration because of it. And so there are a lot of things that are violating the law, but there's nobody to enforce the law.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
so those are some of the things that I would offer over.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go to Mr. Amachi, your closing remarks, and all right, let's listen to you.
I think that enough has been said on this, and basically I would say that in Sudan and South Sudan, the individual factor should be looked at. I think that is what is determining. Individuals are actually driving what happens in these countries. And in the short term, if you really need peace, those individuals must be assured of their security. You can imagine what is going through Dagalo's head, that, well, if I leave, then if I accept peace on the terms of the SAF, then I'm going to lose all these economic largesse that I've garnered over the years. I'm going to lose that control. I'm going to be nothing. I might even end up in prison. So he's not going to give in. And so I think that in negotiating, we should give realistic trade-offs in terms of carrots in order for them to take. Other than that, if we just go in and then say, no, this is no good, so you have to stop, many people or many warlords are not going to listen to that. They will only agree when they are given realistic options to choose from. And so that approach could work. In South Sudan, I think that the situation is not as worse as we have in the north or in Sudan. However, South Sudan is another time bomb, because then if you keep procrastinating, if you keep entrenching yourself, definitely people will get to a point where they can take it no more and it can degenerate into something worse. So I think that over there too, more dialogue should be ensured. So that is my submission for the day.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen, for this episode. I thank you so much for coming to the program and sharing your thoughts and different perspectives in terms of how to go about silencing the guns and the tragedy of the two Sudan definitely, we hope this conversation to go on because we want the guns to silence. But as to what deliberate actions have been put in place or policies have been put in place that can be actionable, that is a different thing altogether. And how to rally these political actors, the regional actors, to come together to resolve some of these issues is also very important. So on this note, we come to another edition of the Sankofa African Series organized by Bell & Associate Consulting in partnership with Budget IT. But once again, thank you to our panelists, and we wish to see you next week, Friday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.